From Villa Park to the Khaki Final. Last time, we covered the first 25 FA Cups. We watched the competition born, watched it grow, watched the gentlemen amateurs of the South give way to the professional working men of the North. We ended in 1896, with Sheffield Wednesday beating Wolverhampton Wanderers at the Crystal Palace Stadium in front of nearly 49,000 people. This time, the records are cleaner. The match reports are better. The newspapers covered football with considerably more detail than they managed in the 1870s, which means we can get closer to the actual football. The rounds, the results, the goals, the great performances and the great shocks, and there are plenty of those to come. The geography of football power in this period is broadly stable. The North and Midlands still dominate, though with some new names emerging and some old giants fading slightly. Newcastle United are the most striking new force. They reach 5 finals in 7 years and win the championship 3 times, a record of sustained excellence that marks them as the dominant club of the Edwardian age, even if the cup frustrates them repeatedly. Sunderland are strong. Everton are strong. Manchester United and Manchester City emerge as real powers for the first time, each winning the cup once in this period, and 2 clubs from outside the First Division. Tottenham in 1901. Wolves in 1908, and twice from the Second Division in Barnsley demonstrate that the Cup's essential democratic promise remained alive and functioning. The qualifying rounds deserve a mention, because they represent an entire other world of Cup football. And while we are thinking about the structure of the competition in this period, let's think about the football itself. How the game was played, what it looked like on the pitch, what a spectator in 1900 or 1907 would have seen that was different from the modern game. The standard formation was the 2-3-5. 2 full-backs, 3 half-backs, 5 forwards. Every club played it, which meant the tactical battles were primarily about which side executed it better, rather than about any fundamental system advantage. The half-back line was the engine room. 3 players who both defended and supported attacks, who distributed the ball from deep, who were expected to cover enormous ground in each 90 minutes. The best half-backs of the era. Colin Vetch of Newcastle, Charlie Roberts of Manchester United, Tommy Boyle of Barnsley, were among the most important players in the country. The game's rules were still evolving through this period, and the evolution was sometimes surprising. Goalkeepers in 1897 could handle the ball only in defense of their goal. By 1901, that had been expanded. He could now handle anywhere in his own half, for any purpose. By 1907, the offside rule had been adjusted so that a player in his own half could never be offside, which opened up more space for passing out from the back. And then in 1912 the pendulum swung back. The goalkeeper was restricted to handling only within his penalty area, compressed to an 18-yard box. The game in 1913 looked different from the game in 1897, and the laws had a great deal to do with it. The ball itself was heavier than the modern ball. A leather case with a lace to close the hole through which the bladder was inserted. A wet leather football saturated after a winter match could weigh considerably more than a dry one. Heading the ball was possible but not always pleasant, and some players avoided it. The physical demands of playing in this era were different from those of the modern game. Less sprinting, more walking and jogging, but the ball was heavier, the pitches were rougher, and there were no substitutes. If you were injured after 20 minutes, you either carried on or your side played with 10 men. The qualifying rounds deserve a mention, because they represent an entire other world of cup football that we tend to ignore when focusing on the famous names and famous matches. By the early 1900s, hundreds of clubs were entering the competition at various qualifying stages, playing through November and December and January to earn a place in the first round proper. Clubs from the 3rd and 4th divisions of regional leagues, from non-league football, from towns and cities across England, all of them chasing the same trophy. Most of them went out quietly, unreported, their cup stories lasting one afternoon and then fading, but a few. Barnsley, for instance, entering through the qualifying rounds, made it all the way to a final. The pyramid existed, and it was permeable, which means we can get closer to the actual football. The rounds, the results, the goals, the great performances, and the great shocks. That is what we are here for. The period we are covering today is the Edwardian era. Broadly speaking, the years from 1897 to the eve of the First World War. England in these years is a country in transition. Victoria dies in 1901, after 63 years on the throne, and the nation barely knows what to do with itself. Edward VII takes over and for 10 years presides over a society that is simultaneously more confident and more anxious than the Victorian era that preceded it. The class system is still rigid, but it is being challenged by the trade unions, by the suffragette movement, by the new Labour Party founded in 1900. And football, ever the mirror of its time, is changing too. The Football League is now well established. The First Division has its aristocrats: Aston Villa, Sunderland, Newcastle United, Everton, clubs with grounds, managers and professional players built over 2 decades of sustained investment. The Cup has gone from being the only competition that mattered to being something different, a chance for the extraordinary, for the upset, for the club that shouldn't be here but somehow is, for the single day that defines a smaller club's entire history. That romance was always present in the Cup, but in this era it crystallizes. You will see it clearly in what follows. The new FA Cup trophy was introduced during this period, first used in 1911, and its history is worth a brief digression because it connects to the wider story of football in the Edwardian era. The FA commissioned Fattorini and Sons of Bradford to design the new trophy after Manchester United had made their own unauthorized replica of the old one following their 1909 win. The FA had never registered the existing design, and the replica made by United demonstrated this gap. The new trophy, 61.5 centimeters tall, more elaborate, distinctly more impressive than its predecessors, is the one whose design is still used today. The original Fattorini trophy itself was used for 81 seasons before being retired after the 1991 final. The current trophy design was produced in 2014. There is an amusing story attached to the Antiques Roadshow television program in 2016, when a version of the old Fattorini trophy was brought to an expert who valued it at £1 million. He suggested, peering at the design of grapes and vines around the base, that it might not have been specifically commissioned for the FA, but was instead an off-the-shelf design originally intended as a wine cooler. A member of the Fattorini family was subsequently invited to the program to demonstrate that this was wrong. The cup was specifically commissioned, specifically designed for the FA. It is not a wine cooler. The football world was somewhat relieved. The new FA Cup trophy was introduced during this period, the one designed by Fattorini and Sons of Bradford that we still recognize today, first used in 1911. The old replica of the original stolen cup was quietly retired. Appropriately enough, the first winners of the new trophy were Bradford City, from the same city that made it. Crystal Palace hosts every final in this block except the last one. The ground had been home to the final since 1895, and by 1897 was the established, expected, almost traditional venue. But it is worth spending a moment on what Crystal Palace actually was as a sporting venue, because it was peculiar by modern standards. The Crystal Palace Stadium was built into a natural hillside at Sydenham, South London, in the grounds of the exhibition park that surrounded the famous iron and glass palace that had been built for the Great Exhibition of 1851. The site had been used for various sporting events since the late Victorian era, and the FA adopted it for the Cup final because it could accommodate very large crowds through its natural terracing. The hillside terraces descended toward the pitch, with spectators standing on steep banks of grass and cinder. There were no individual seats for most spectators. You stood where you could find space, and you hoped you had a view. The ground's capacity was theoretically unlimited, which led to the extraordinary attendance figures. Over 100,000 people on multiple occasions. But those attendances came at a cost. The sightlines were frequently terrible. 20,000 people at the 1913 final reportedly had no clear view of the pitch at all. Contemporary accounts describe spectators craning and stretching, hoisting children onto shoulders, climbing trees and telegraph poles and the roofs of nearby buildings to catch a glimpse of the action. The noise of 100,000 people can mask a lot of visual inadequacy, but the Crystal Palace Stadium was really pushing the boundaries of what a football crowd could endure. Now, to the football. The FA Cup, 1896–97. In the year Aston Villa completed their double, Queen Victoria had been on the throne for 60 years. Her Diamond Jubilee celebrations were just 10 weeks away. The great imperial age of Britain was at its confident, uneasy peak. The average working man earned perhaps a shilling a day. The 65,000 who came to Crystal Palace had made a day of it, a train excursion, a pie, a match, and the long trip home. Before we discuss this competition, a word about the season in which it took place. Aston Villa in 1896–97 were the finest football club in England, and it is not a particularly close call. They won the First Division Championship by 11 points. A margin that in a 30-game season represents something approaching total dominance. They scored 73 league goals. Their top scorer was Fred Weldon, a forward signed from Small Heath. What we now know as Birmingham City, for £350, and he was magnificent. Their captain and organising genius was John Devey. Their manager was George Ramsay, the Scottish pioneer who had been with the club since the 1870s and had built the finest football machine in England. Villa entered the Cup at the first round proper, as was their right, as a First Division club. The qualifying rounds were for clubs outside that charmed circle, and they played through October, November and December of 1896 while the big clubs rested and watched. By January, the first round proper began and the elite clubs entered. Their run began in January 1897 with a 5-0 demolition of Newcastle United at their Perry Bar ground. Villa Park would not open until later that same year. Newcastle at this point were a respectable First Division side, but they had no answer whatsoever to the pace and movement of Villa's forward line. Weldon and Devey ran riot. Round 2 brought Notts County, and Villa won 2-1. Then Preston North End in the third round. Here Villa needed a replay. The first match ended 1-1. Back they came for the replay, which ended 0-0. A blank, grinding 90 minutes that settled nothing. A third match was required, and Villa finally won 3-2, Preston making them work hard for every inch. The semi-final, played at Bramall Lane in Sheffield, brought Liverpool. Liverpool were a decent First Division side. They would finish 5th that season, but they were well beaten. Villa won 3-0, Jack Cowan scoring twice and Athersmith adding the third, and the Midlanders were through to the Crystal Palace Stadium. Everton awaited them in the final. This was Everton's second final. They had lost to Wolverhampton Wanderers in 1893, and they came to the Crystal Palace Stadium knowing they had a chance. The Toffees had finished runners-up in the First Division that season, and they had good players: Edgar Chadwick, John Bell, Dickie Boyle. This would not be easy. The game on the 10th of April, 1897, was extraordinary not just as a football match, but as a piece of sporting history. While Villa were playing the Cup final at Crystal Palace, Derby County were playing a league fixture elsewhere. Derby needed to win that match to keep the title race alive. They did not. Derby lost, Villa won the Cup, and the double was confirmed in the same afternoon. Nobody present at Crystal Palace knew it was happening until the news arrived by telegram at half-time. The crowd roared. It became one of those afternoons that crystallize a club's entire identity. The match itself had everything. John Campbell put Villa ahead after 18 minutes. Jack Bell equalised for Everton almost immediately. Dickie Boyle put Everton in front. Fred Weldon drew Villa level. Jimmy Crabtree scored the winner just before half-time, a goal that settled the match and secured a lead that Villa, playing with the composure and organisation that had defined their season, held comfortably through the second half. The 65,891 attendants saw a game of 5 goals in 44 minutes, with the lead changing twice before Crabtree's winner just before half-time. The second half was goalless. Villa containing, organising, seeing it out, which was entirely in keeping with who they were as a side. George Ramsay's teams did not panic. They defended their lead with the same intelligence with which they built it. John Campbell, who opened the scoring for Villa after 18 minutes, was one of the underappreciated forwards of the era. Technically excellent, capable of playing wide or through the centre. He had been a consistent contributor to Villa's success throughout the double season. His 13 league goals, with Weldon's 18 as the top scorer, were a key part of Villa's title win. His cup final goal was taken with calm authority, a driven shot from inside the area, after a through ball that split the Everton defence. Jack Bell's equaliser for Everton was equally well taken, a quick reaction in the penalty area, Dickie Boyle's goal to make it 2-1. Everton produced the only moment in the match when Villa's supporters feared the worst. Then Weldon equalised, Then Crabtree scored. Then silence from Everton for 46 minutes. Villa's double was only the second in Football League history, after Preston's invincible season of 1888–89. It has only been achieved by a handful of clubs. FA Cup, 1897–98. Nottingham Forest's first. In 1898, H.G. Wells published The War of the Worlds. Bram Stoker's Dracula had appeared the year before. These were strange and imaginative times. The Jubilee glow was fading, and the country was starting to ask questions about what came after Victoria. After Villa's majestic 1897 campaign, 1898 brought a new name to the trophy: Nottingham Forest. One of the oldest clubs in the world, founded in 1865 with a proud if occasionally turbulent history, claimed their first FA Cup. They beat Derby County 3-1 in the final, and it was a win that captured something essential about the period. Two clubs from the East Midlands, connected by the Trent and separated by a fierce rivalry, playing for the biggest domestic prize in football. This was the year that the FA introduced the option of extra time in replays, which is a small administrative fact but worth noting as part of the competition's evolution. 1897 also brought more fundamental codifications. For the first time, the laws formally specified that each team must field exactly 11 players and that a match lasts 90 minutes. The halfway line appeared on pitches across England. These things had been assumed for years, but assumption is not law, and the game had reached the point where it needed to write things down. Forest's route to the final began with a comfortable 4-0 win over Grimsby Town in the first round, Grimsby having earned their place in the main draw through the qualifying stages. Then Gainsborough Trinity were beaten 4-0 in the second round. Gainsborough, a Lincolnshire club who had been playing first-class football for decades and were then in the second division, gave Forest no real trouble. The third round brought West Bromwich Albion, and Forest won 3-2 in what was evidently a much tighter contest. The semi-final was against Southampton, the Southern League champions who in this era were beginning to make their presence felt in the Cup. The first match ended 1-1. And Forest were back for the replay at Crystal Palace the following Wednesday. They won 2-0. Derby County's route to the final had been similarly hard-fought. They beat Aston Villa in the first round. The holders beaten in round 1, which is exactly the sort of result the Cup specialises in producing. Then Wolverhampton Wanderers in the second round. Then Everton in the semi-final at Mole in U, where Steve Bloomer, Derby's extraordinary centre-forward, was simply too good. Bloomer was the driving force behind Derby's 3-1 win. And so to the final on the 16th of April at Crystal Palace. The match turned on one moment in the first half. Arthur Capes of Forest opened the scoring after 19 minutes. Steve Bloomer equalised for Derby 31 minutes in with a header from a free kick, the ball hitting the underside of the crossbar and crossing the line. It felt like it could go either way. And then, in the 42nd minute, goalkeeper Jack Fryer of Derby failed to hold a shot from Forest's Charlie Richards. The ball dropped at Capes' feet, and he turned it into the empty net for his second goal. A slightly fortuitous goal, perhaps. These things happen. But the kind of moment that defines cup finals. Forest went in at half-time 2-1 in front, and they held it. In the 86th minute, John Macpherson scored a third, and Forest were home. One piece of context worth mentioning. Derby County beat Nottingham Forest 5-0 just 5 days before the final, Forest resting 6 of their cup final players for that league match. The mind games involved in this, deliberate bluffing or simply logical squad rotation, are unclear. What is clear is that being hammered 5-0 did not prevent Forest from winning the cup. Final score: Nottingham Forest 3, Derby County 1. 62,017 were in attendance at Crystal Palace. Forest's win was their first, and for a very long time it seemed their OY major honour. They would not win the cup again until 1959. They would not win the league until 1978. The club has always had something of the difficult, brilliant outsider about it. Nottingham is not a city that dominates English football in the way that Manchester, Liverpool or even Birmingham does, and Forest's periods of glory have always felt unlikely, romantic, slightly miraculous. The 1898 Cup is part of that tradition. Steve Bloomer, Derby's great forward, had contributed enormously to getting his club to the final but could not prevent the defeat. He was a player of extraordinary quality. Short, slight, with a deceptive pace and a ferocious shot. And in an era before statistics were routinely compiled, his goal-scoring record is still impressive enough to mark him as one of the finest forwards of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. He would return to the Crystal Palace Stadium twice more, each time on the losing side. Forest's 1898 team was built around collective organisation rather than individual stars. The two Foreman brothers, Frank and Fred, were key figures, providing solidity and intelligence across the half-back line. Arthur Capes, the double scorer, was a forward of real quality whose career deserves to be better known than it is. He scored Forest's first goal through a defensive wall, an early example of the free-kick technique, and his second was a composed finish under pressure. The fact that he scored twice in a cup final while one of his team's players was injured and effectively reduced to a passenger for much of the second half speaks to his importance to the side. The 1898 Cup was also significant for a geographical reason. It was the first final between two clubs from the same region. Both Derby and Forest are East Midlands clubs, separated by 15 miles and the River Trent. Local pride was therefore at stake in a way that had not quite been true of previous finals, and the intensity of the occasion reflected that. The East Midlands derby that produced the FA Cup final was also, in a sense, the first cup final that felt like a local rivalry, as well as a national one. FA Cup, 1898-99. Sheffield United second. In the year Sheffield United beat Derby 4-1, Marie and Pierre Curie were in their Paris lab, having just coined the word radioactivity. Bayer launched aspirin as a commercial product that same year. Nobody at Crystal Palace knew about any of it, but the world was changing at a pace nobody had experienced before. Sheffield United had won the league championship in 1897-98. By the standards of the era, they were the best team in England. They came into the 1898-99 Cup as favourites, though they were modest enough in the league. They would finish 16th that season, just above the relegation places. The Cup, as ever, cared nothing for league form. Derby County were back for a second successive final, and for Derby supporters this would become a pattern they found deeply uncomfortable. 2 finals in succession, 1898 runner-up, 1899 runner-up, there were mutterings about a curse, stories about gypsies being moved from the land that became the baseball ground, their curse being that Derby would never win the Cup. It sounds like folklore, and it probably is, but by the end of this sequence, Derby supporters had cause to take it seriously. United's semi-final against Liverpool was one of the most drawn-out affairs in Cup history. It took 3 matches to resolve. The first, at Nottingham, ended 2-2. The second, at Burnden Park in Bolton, ended 4-4, one of the most extraordinary matches the Cup had produced, Sheffield pulling level twice in the final minutes after Liverpool led by 2 goals. The third, at the former Fallowfield Stadium in Manchester, the ground that had hosted the chaotic 1893 final, was abandoned at half-time due to a crowd invasion. Blades were winning 1-0 when the game was called off. A fourth match was arranged at Derby's ground, and United finally won it 1-0 after a contest that had stretched over 4 separate afternoons. Derby's semi-final against Stoke was rather more straightforward. Steve Bloomer, magnificent all season, scored all 3 goals in a 3-1 win. Bloomer was perhaps the finest centre-forward in England in this period, a man of extraordinary natural ability with the ball at his feet, and he arrived at Crystal Palace for his second successive final full of confidence. The final on the 15th of April at the Crystal Palace Stadium was dramatic. Derby took the lead through John Bogue after just 12 minutes, and going in at half-time a goal ahead, Bloomer and his teammates must have thought their day had come. But the second half belonged entirely to Sheffield United. Walter Bennett equalised. Billy Beer put United ahead. John Almond made it 3. Fred Priest scored the 4th in the 89th minute to cap one of the great second-half recoveries in Cup final history. The crowd of 73,833 was a new world record, though it would itself be broken only 2 years later, when the 1901 final drew over 110,000. The game had become a national event, the biggest annual gathering of people in England. For Sheffield United, this was a statement. 2 cups in 3 years. The semi-final marathon against Liverpool had been a draining experience, but the final itself was compelling. Coming from behind to win 4-1 demonstrated not just quality but real character under pressure. Ernest Needham, their captain, was one of the most respected players of the era, a man whose book on football tactics, published 2 years later in 1901, demonstrated an analytical intelligence about the game that very few professionals of his generation possessed. His vow to make amends for the Tottenham defeat was public and heartfelt, and he delivered on it. Walter Bennett, Sheffield United's outside right, was one of the fastest players in England and had been outstanding throughout the cup campaign. His goal in the second half, the equaliser after Derby had led at half-time, was the turning point of the final. From that moment, United seized control and did not relinquish it. Billy Beer's goal put them in front. Almond's third killed the match as a contest. Priest's fourth in the 89th minute was the exclamation mark on a stunning second-half performance. For Derby, the story of the curse was beginning to build. 2 finals in succession, both as runners-up. Whether a gypsy's displeasure from decades earlier had anything to do with it is, of course, doubtful. What is not doubtful is that Derby never won the FA Cup, not in the Victorian era, not in the Edwardian era, not in the interwar years, not until 1946. Their wait lasted until after the Second World War, when they beat Charlton Athletic 4-1 after extra time, a wait of many decades that had allowed the curse legend to grow to considerable proportions. FA Cup, 1899 to 1900, Berry's first. The 1900s began with Victoria still Queen. She would die the following January, ending 63 years on the throne. The Boer War had been grinding on since October. In Paris, the great Exposition Universelle had just opened its doors. 50 million visitors would pass through before November. The century was turning, and everything was about to change. The turn of the century brought with it a final that was also the last of the Victorian era, and a rather extraordinary one at that. Bury beat Southampton 4-0. Southampton in this era were a remarkable club. They played in the Southern League, the professional organisation for clubs in the south of England who were not part of the Football League, and they were its dominant force, having won it in each of the previous 3 seasons. As champions, they were given a bye through the qualifying rounds into the main draw, which was an acknowledgement by the FA that the Southern League was a professional competition. They had beaten Newcastle United and West Bromwich Albion on the way to the final, which was no small achievement. A note about Southampton that tells you everything about the nature of football at this time. Although they were a Southern club in name, there were only 2 Southerners in the team. The rest were recruited from across Britain, predominantly from Scotland. The professionalisation of football meant that talent flowed to wherever it was valued, regardless of geography. Bury's route to the final had been far from easy. They needed 3 replays to get through the competition, one against Notts County in the second round, one against Nottingham Forest in the semi-final that they came desperately close to losing before winning 3-2 in extra time. They were within 5 minutes of elimination before the comeback began. These are the margins on which cup campaigns hinge. The final, played in a heat wave on the 21st of April at Crystal Palace before 68,945 spectators, was played in quite different conditions from the muddy winter contests we saw in the Victorian era. Burr were simply magnificent. Jasper McLucky scored twice, Willie Wood scored, Jack Plant scored, 3-0 at half-time, and Southampton never recovered. Bury captain Jack Pray received the trophy from Lord James of Hereford. Winning the cup proved immediately and practically useful for the club. They had debts of £1,230 before the final. The gate receipts converted that deficit into a credit balance of £1,329. Football economics in 1900 were brutally direct. A cup run could save your club or at least pay its bills. For Bury, a modest Lancashire club with no great wealth behind them, this was no small thing. Bury's semi-final against Nottingham Forest is one of the great near misses of Edwardian football. Trailing 2-1 with fewer than 5 minutes remaining, Bury seemed finished. Then Saga equalised to make it 2-2, and then with the Forest players barely able to believe what was happening, McLucky scored in the dying moments to make it 3-2, sending the match into extra time, which Bury survived to win. The Manchester Guardian wrote that Bury had shown extraordinary pluck, and nobody who witnessed that semi-final could have disputed it. They took that grit and determination to the Crystal Palace Stadium and applied it to Southampton, with consequences that were far less close. One other note about this final that speaks to the peculiarities of Edwardian football. Southampton's team contained only 2 players who were actually from Southampton. The rest were from across Britain recruited to a professional club in the south, living and working there but owing no particular allegiance to the city beyond their contract. This was perfectly normal. It is one of the reasons that communities' passionate identification with their local football clubs had such an interesting tension at its heart. The players were professionals following work. The supporters were locals investing real emotion. The relationship was already complicated in 1900. Their collapse against Bury, 3-0 at half-time, 4-0 at the end, was devastating. They would be back 2 years later, but the cup would continue to elude them for decades. The FA Cup, 1900 to 1901. Tottenham's miracle. The final of 1901 was played 3 months after Queen Victoria died. Edward VII came to the throne. A new era had begun. Marconi sent the first transatlantic radio signal that December. A shed in Kitty Hawk, America, 2 brothers named Wright were quietly building something. Before we get to the Tottenham story, let's take stock of where the cup stood at the turn of the century. 29 competitions had been played. The competition had grown from 15 clubs to hundreds. The Crystal Palace Stadium venue was established. The crowds were growing year by year. The Football League, now 13 years old, had transformed the financial landscape of the game, and yet the cup retained its own distinct character, more random, more romantic, more capable of the extraordinary result than the league could ever be. The clubs that had defined the cup's first 30 years were beginning to give way to new forces. Wanderers were gone. Royal Engineers were long gone. Old Etonians had not appeared in a final since 1882. Blackburn Rovers had been dominant in the 1880s but had won nothing since 1891. The Victorian giants were stepping back, and the Edwardian powers were stepping forward. Everton, Newcastle, Sunderland, the Sheffield clubs, Aston Villa still very much present. And somewhere, just outside the establishment's line of sight, was a non-league club from Tottenham that was about to do something nobody had done before, and nobody has done since. This is one of the greatest stories in FA Cup history. One of the greatest stories in English football history, full stop. Tottenham Hotspur won the FA Cup in 1901. That in itself is not extraordinary. Spurs have won it 8 times in total. What requires careful examination, however, is exactly how a non-league club managed to win the most prestigious knockout competition in England when competing against professional football league clubs who had resources, facilities and playing squads that theoretically far exceeded what the Southern League could offer. The answer lies in 3 things: Tottenham's quality, their organisation, and the inherent unpredictability of the cup format. By 1901, Spurs had several players who would have been competitive in the First Division. Sandy Brown's 15 goals in one cup season speaks for itself. John Cameron's tactical intelligence set the team up effectively against stronger opponents, and in a knockout competition, where a single bad afternoon eliminates the most dominant club, quality over 90 minutes matters as much as quality over an entire season. There is also the matter of the first-round draw. The FA's structure of giving Southern League champions a bye to the first round and entered at the same stage as most First Division clubs. From there, it was a straight knockout tournament, and Tottenham were good enough to win it. Tottenham's route rewards examination because it shows how thoroughly they dismantled every obstacle. First round, Preston North End at Deepdale, one of the great names of Victorian football. The first match was drawn 1-1, Brown equalising late. The midweek replay was extraordinary. Brown scored a hat-trick, Cameron scored once. Spurs won 4-2 against a First Division club that had expected to brush them aside. Message sent. Second round, Bury the holders. Spurs won 2-1. Third round, Reading a draw in the first match, then beaten 3-0 in the replay. Semi-final, West Bromwich Albion, a First Division side. Spurs won 4-0 in what was described as a comprehensive performance. Brown scored in every single round, every one, accumulating 15 goals across the season. His composure, consistency, and ability to deliver in the highest pressure moments across every stage of a cup campaign makes him one of the great individual performers in the competition's entire history. The context for Tottenham's achievement is worth spelling out carefully. By 1901, the Football League was 13 years old and dominated by the clubs of the North and Midlands. The Southern League, to which Tottenham belonged, was a professional competition but was regarded by the football establishment as distinctly second-rate. Southern clubs joining the Cup had to pre-qualify unless they were league champions, and even then they entered with little expectation of progress beyond the early rounds. For Tottenham to win it outright, beating First Division clubs, including cup holders Bury along the way, was, there is no other word for it, astonishing. One detail about the 1901 final that deserves to be remembered. Sandy Brown, Tottenham's centre-forward, scored a goal in every single round of the competition. Every round, including both the final and the replay. 15 goals in total across the season. It remains one of the great individual cup performances in the competition's history, made all the more remarkable by the fact that he was achieving it for a non-league club against opposition from the highest tier of professional football. Tottenham entered the competition with ambition. They had won the Southern League Championship the previous season, which gave them an automatic place in the first round, bypassing the qualifying stages. Their player-manager was John Cameron, a Scottish inside forward who organised the team with a tactical intelligence that was ahead of its time. Their centre-forward was Sandy Brown, a prolific and powerful Scottish striker who would go on to achieve something remarkable during this campaign. Note first that the competition was suspended briefly in January, following the death of Queen Victoria on the 22nd. When Tottenham came to play their first-round tie against Preston North End at Deepdale, the two sides wore different colours because of a kit clash. Spurs fell behind to an unlikely McMahon goal, and it looked as though their day might end there. But Jack Kirwan crossed for Sandy Brown to equalise late, and in the replay at Deepdale, Brown scored a hat-trick in a 4-2 win for Spurs. Cup holders Bury were next, and Spurs beat them 2-1. Then Reading were dispatched 3-0 in the third round, and West Bromwich Albion, a proper First Division club, were beaten in the semi-final. The final, on the 20th of April at Crystal Palace, drew over 110,000 people, a world record for a football match at the time. The attendance was partly a consequence of the novelty. A non-league London club in the final, playing in front of their own supporters, had pulled in an enormous crowd. Sheffield United, the cup holders from 1899, were the opponents. A First Division side with real quality, they had beaten Aston Villa in the semi-final. Fred Priest put them ahead. Sandy Brown equalised, his goal in every round, a remarkable consistency of performance. Brown put Spurs in front in the second half, and then came one of the most controversial moments in cup final history. United's Bert Lipsham fired in a shot that goalkeeper George Clawley fumbled behind the line. The linesman flagged for a corner. Clawley placed the ball for a goal kick. The referee then changed his mind and awarded a goal to United, with Walter Bennett credited as the scorer. It was 2-2, and there was no extra time allowed in a first match. The replay at Burnden Park in Bolton, 6 days later, attracted only 20,470, a tiny crowd compared to the first match, but those present saw history. Cameron scored first for Spurs. Tom Smith made it 2. Sandy Brown, who had now scored in every single round of the competition, 15 goals in total across the season, headed the third from a corner. United's Fred Priest scored a late consolation, but there was no stopping Tottenham. The cup went to a non-league club. The Football League establishment was appalled. It has never happened since. Final score: Tottenham Hotspur 3, Sheffield United 1. Replay at Burnden Park. The first match at Crystal Palace finished 2-2 before 110,820. The FA Cup, 1901 to 1902. Sheffield United win it back. In the year of Sheffield United's second cup, the Boer War finally ended in May, 9 weeks after the final, and Edward VII's coronation took place at Westminster Abbey that August. Enrico Caruso made his first gramophone recording. Arthur Conan Doyle brought Sherlock Holmes back from the dead in The Hound of the Baskervilles. The age of celebrity was beginning. Sheffield United were back. Having lost the cup to Tottenham the previous year, in circumstances they still felt aggrieved about, they came into the 1901-02 competition determined to put things right. Their captain, Ernest Needham, who had written a book about football tactics published the previous year, reportedly vowed that his team had let the North down by losing to a non-league bunch of southern pansies, and that they would not let it happen again. Southampton were back too, the third Southern League team in successive years to reach the final, and the last team from outside the Football League ever to do so. Their run to the final included a first-round meeting with the cup holders, Tottenham Hotspur, at White Hart Lane. That match ended 1-1, and the replay at Southampton's Dell also ended in a draw, with extra time unable to separate them. A third match at M Park in Reading settled it. Southampton won 2-1. In the process, they knocked out the cup holders in the first round, which is exactly what happens in the cup when you let your guard down for a moment. One remarkable figure on the Southampton side deserves mention: C.B. Fry. Charles Burgess Fry was perhaps the greatest all-round sportsman of the Edwardian era. He played first-class cricket for Sussex and England, equalled the world long jump record in 1893, played football for Southampton and England, and was by all accounts a man of extraordinary physical gifts. His presence at right back for Southampton in the 1902 Cup final is one of those facts that makes this era of football feel so different from the modern game. Sheffield United's massive goalkeeper William Folk, known as Fatty, a man of 6 feet 3 inches and 22 stone, who was nonetheless agile enough to play at the highest level, returned to Bramall Lane having lost his cup final the previous year and was determined to collect a winner's medal. The first match at Crystal Palace on the 19th of April was a tight, closely contested affair. Alf Common, United's inside forward, put Sheffield in front. With just 2 minutes remaining, Southampton captain Harry Wood equalised, and Wood was in what most observers agreed was a clearly offside position when the ball reached him, having been tying his bootless. The referee, however, allowed it. United were furious. The match ended 1-1. In the replay the following Saturday, also at Crystal Palace, Sheffield United were without their influential winger Walter Bennett. It proved decisive. George Headley and Billy Barnes scored for United. Albert Brown replied for Southampton. But it was United's day. 2-1. Let's look at the detail of how that second final unfolded, because it had more drama than the scoreline suggests. Alf Common, Sheffield United's inside forward, who would 3 years later become the first player in history to be transferred for £1,000, a fee that scandalised football at the time, opened the scoring early in the second half with a driven effort. United looked comfortable. Southampton pressed, without quite finding the quality to breach a well-organised Sheffield defence. And then, 2 minutes from time, Harry Wood's equaliser, Southampton's captain, technically in an offside position tying his bootlace, receiving the ball and putting it past Fatty. The linesman's flag went up. The referee waved play on. The whole of Northern England expressed its opinion loudly. The replay was a week later, also at Crystal Palace. Without Bennett, their best winger, injured and unavailable, Sheffield United had to reorganise their forward line, and yet they managed it. Headley scored, Barnes scored, Brown scored for Southampton in response. 2-1, and Needham had his medal. The North had its trophy back. The observation that Southampton were the last team from outside the Football League ever to reach an FA Cup final is worth dwelling on. 3 successive years, Southampton in 1900, Tottenham in 1901, Southampton again in 1902, had seen a Southern League club in the final. The Football League's response was to tighten the automatic qualification rules, making it progressively harder for non-league clubs to advance, and to gradually absorb the most successful Southern League clubs into the league itself. Tottenham joined in 1908. Southampton and others followed in 1920 when the third division was created, the great divide between the Football League and everyone else, which has defined English football's pyramid ever since, was being constructed in these years, brick by brick. The 1902 final itself had drama at its heart quite apart from the result. Sheffield United's massive goalkeeper William Folk, 6 feet 3, 22 stone, known throughout English football as Fatty, and apparently unconcerned by the nickname, was a figure of real curiosity. He was enormously agile despite his size, difficult to score against because of the sheer volume of goal he occupied, and he had already won a cup final in 1899. He was also famously temperamental. Stories of folk picking up an opponent who had annoyed him and depositing him in the goal net may be apocryphal, but were entirely consistent with his personality. The chant, "Who ate all the pies," was believed to have originated in the 1890s regarding the Sheffield United goalkeeper. Harry Wood's equalising goal for Southampton, 2 minutes from time, while he was in an offside position tying his shoelace, is one of the great disputed cup final moments. The linesman flagged. The referee waved play on. It was the kind of decision that defines officiating in the pre-television era, utterly subjective, instantly controversial, impossible to prove or disprove. Sheffield United's players were livid. Southampton were delighted. Needham called it, privately and publicly, a scandal. The replay, where United won without the injured Bennett available, settled the matter through football rather than controversy, which perhaps made the result feel more satisfying even to those who had felt aggrieved. Final score: Sheffield United 2, Southampton 1, replay at Crystal Palace. That season also brought a significant change to what a goalkeeper could legally do. From 1901, the laws had expanded their handling rights. A keeper could now handle the ball anywhere in their own half, for any purpose, no longer just in defence of their goal. It sounds like a minor wording change. It was not. Fatty Folk, the finest keeper in England, could now legally roam to the halfway line and catch the ball in his hands. The West Ham incident that had prompted the change was still fresh. An opposing forward had bundled a keeper into the net with the ball in his hands, and the goal stood because the old law permitted it. The new law drew a cleaner line. 1902 also brought a quiet but useful amendment to the penalty law. From this season, the kick no longer had to be directed forward. A taker could now aim in any direction. It sounds obvious now. It was not always so. That same year also brought the most visible change to the pitch itself. Before 1902, the penalty area was not a box at all. It was a dotted line running all the way across the pitch, 18 yards from goal. The penalty kick itself could be taken from anywhere along a line 12 yards out. There was no spot, just a line. In 1902, all of that was replaced by the rectangular box we know now, with a fixed penalty spot dead centre, 12 yards from goal, and the smaller 6-yard box in front of the goalkeeper. For the first time, a Crystal Palace crowd stood around a pitch that looked, to modern eyes, recognisably like football. The FA Cup, 1902 to 1903. Bury's 6, in the year Bury won for the second time. Orville and Wilbur Wright were in their bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, working toward the December morning when they would make the first powered flight in history. That flight lasted 12 seconds. Meanwhile, at Crystal Palace, 6 goals in a cup final felt like the most extraordinary thing imaginable. There are cup finals that are tight, and there are cup finals that are not. The 1903 final was emphatically not. Bury beat Derby County 6-0. By half-time it was 1-0, and still apparently competitive. What happened in the second half was something between a demolition and a comedy of errors by Derby, who were missing their best player, Steve Bloomer. The name has come up repeatedly in this era, and it comes up again here as an absence. Bloomer was one of the finest footballers England had produced to this point, a centre-forward of great natural ability and tremendous goal-scoring instinct, and he had been instrumental in getting Derby to this final. But he arrived at Crystal Palace unfit, declared himself unable to play, and watched from the sidelines as his teammates were taken apart. Derby's goalkeeper, Jack Fryer, had sustained a groin injury 5 days before the final, and was also far from fit. He played anyway. There was no substitute available, and the backup goalkeeper had never played at senior level, but he was visibly impaired throughout. Bury's route to the final had been immaculate. That word, immaculate, is not an exaggeration. They conceded no goals in any round. They beat every opponent without the humiliation of an equaliser. The cup competition of 1902-03 was not a weak one. They faced Wolverhampton Wanderers, Sheffield United, and Aston Villa before they even reached the final, which is 3 First Division clubs of excellent quality. They beat all three without conceding. Not once in 11 cup matches did an opposing forward find the net against Bury. Their second-round win over Sheffield United at Bramall Lane deserves particular mention. United were the holders. They had beaten Southampton in the 1902 replay, and they had the formidable Folk in goal, the agile if enormous goalkeeper who made scoring against Sheffield United extremely difficult. Bury beat them, and the goal they conceded in doing so was 0. It was a result that told you everything about what kind of team Arthur Fairclough had built. Bury's route to the final. They beat Wolverhampton Wanderers in the first round, Sheffield United in the second, beaten 1-0 at Bramall Lane, which was a Feichelt hurdle, and Notts County in the quarter-final. Their semi-final against Aston Villa was played at Goodison Park before a crowd of roughly 50,000, and they won 3-0 with surprising ease, Villa apparently nowhere near the form that had made them so formidable 6 years earlier. In the final, George Ross opened the scoring for Bury after 20 minutes. Then in the second half, in a remarkable 15-minute burst, the game became a rout. Charlie Saga scored on 48 minutes, Joe Leeming scored on 56, Willie Wood on 57, Jack Plant on 59. 3 goals in 3 minutes and Derby were finished. Leeming completed his brace on 76 minutes for the 6th. Bury also equalled Preston's 1889 record of winning the Cup without conceding a single goal in any round. Two clubs 14 years apart, and it has never been done since. Bury's 2 Cup wins in 1900 and 1903 are separated by 3 years and represent the peak of a club that has since fallen a very long way. To fully appreciate Bury's 6-0, consider that both clubs had 43 points after 30 games in the First Division, identical. This was not a match between a superpower and a makeweight. It was a match between two comparable sides, and Bury produced a performance of such sustained excellence, and Derby, to be fair, a performance of such collapse, that the scoreline looks almost impossible for 60 years, until Manchester City equalled it against Watford in 2019. That scoreline in 2019 felt like a demolition. In 1903, it felt like an aberration, a freakish result that the record books record with a certain disbelief. George Ross, who opened the scoring for Bury after 20 minutes, was also their captain and a Scotland international. The goal timings tell the story of the second half. Bury scored 3 times in 3 minutes. Derby's goalkeeper Fryer, playing through a groin strain, barely had time to retrieve the ball from his own net before it was back in there. They are currently in the lower reaches of non-league football, effectively dissolved and reformed, their famous old Gig Lane ground in an uncertain state. The 1903 Cup win sits in the club's history like a dream from another world. Final score: Bury 6, Derby County 0. The FA Cup 1903 to 1904. Manchester City's Welsh Wizard, Billy Meredith. In the year Meredith scored the only goal at Crystal Palace, the Wright brothers were extending their flights from seconds to minutes, from 12 seconds the previous December to 5 minutes that autumn. The following year they would achieve 39. J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. Debuted in London in December, a story about a boy who refused to grow up, published at precisely the moment the Edwardian world was doing everything it could to stay young. Manchester City won the FA Cup for the first time in 1904. It was the first major trophy of any description won by any Manchester club, a fact that tells you something about the city's footballing development relative to the great Lancashire clubs of the previous decade. City had come close before, but never delivered. Now they had Billy Meredith, and Billy Meredith was a different class from almost anyone else in the country. Meredith was Welsh. He came from a mining village near the English border in Chirk, and he was the finest winger in England, possibly in Britain. He played with a toothpick habitually in his mouth, a habit that became so associated with him that illustrations and cartoons of the period always showed it. He was fast, technically excellent, brave and clever, and he had been at Manchester City since 1894. He was in his late 20s now, at the absolute peak of his powers, and City had built a team around him that was capable of winning things. Their route to the final was impressively efficient. They beat Sunderland 3-2 in the first round, then Woolwich Arsenal 2-0 in the second, then Middlesbrough after a replay 3-1 in the quarter-final. Their semi-final against Sheffield Wednesday, played at Goodison Park, was won 3-0, with 2 goals from Sandy Turnbull and 1 from Meredith himself. Bolton Wanderers awaited them in what was the first all-Lancashire FA Cup final in the competition's history. Bolton were a second-division side, which on paper made them the underdogs, though Bolton had been reaching semi-finals for years and knew how to play in big occasions. Their best forward, Boyd, was injured for the final and could not play, which was a significant blow. The final, on the 23rd of April at the Crystal Palace Stadium, was played in fine weather before a crowd of around 61,000. The dignitaries present included the Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, which gives you some sense of how significant the FA Cup final had become to national life. Also present were the cricketers W.G. Grace, C.B. Fry and Len Jessup, and several members of the Australian cricket touring party. Football and cricket shared a social world in this era that has long since dissolved. The match was decided 20 minutes in. George Livingstone played a pass down the right channel that eluded Bolton's Archie Freeburn. Meredith collected the ball, drove toward goal, beat the fullback Bob Struthers with a change of pace, and shot past goalkeeper Di Davies into the left corner. 1-0. Bolton disputed it, claiming Meredith was offside when the ball was played through. It was the only goal of the game. Bolton pressed hard in the second half, and City defended with real discipline. Fullback Herbert Burgess was outstanding, but they could not find a way through. The cup came to Manchester for the first time. Meredith's goal was the defining moment of a fine career. He would win the cup again with Manchester United in 1909, becoming one of the very few players to win it with 2 different Manchester clubs, and he played for Wales until he was in his mid-40s. His longevity alone makes him remarkable. But in 1904 it was the goal that defined him. The 20th-minute winner in the first FA Cup final, won by a Manchester club, scored by the finest winger of his generation, disputed by Bolton to this day. Bolton Wanderers' appearance in this final, coming from the second division, foreshadowed what would become a recurring theme in the cup. Smaller clubs from the lower divisions making improbable runs. Bolton themselves would be back. In the 1920s they would dominate the cup, winning it 3 times in 8 years, but in 1904 they were the nearly men, the second division side who came so close and went home without the prize. Their striker, Boyd, injured and absent, would always wonder what might have been. The atmosphere in and around Crystal Palace on the 23rd of April 1904 was one of the great football events of the Edwardian era. Around 30,000 supporters from Lancashire had made the journey to London, many of them sleeping on the platforms at Euston and St Pancras, having arrived the previous day. The 2 sets of supporters mingled freely, in the manner of an era before the sharp divisions between rival fans that later centuries would produce. The Sporting Chronicle noted a convivial atmosphere between the blue and white of City and the white and blue of Bolton, a communal pride in a Lancashire occasion. Prime Minister Arthur Balfour's presence in the Royal Box tells you something about the status of the FA Cup final in national life. This was not a sporting event at the margins of public consciousness. It was a fixture in the social calendar for people of all classes, from the Prime Minister to the mill worker who had saved up for weeks to afford the excursion fare from Manchester. In this respect, the cup was democratic. The ticket prices varied, but the occasion belonged to everyone. Billy Meredith's genius as a winger lay in his capacity to appear ineffectual for long periods, drifting through a game, rarely threatening, lulling defenders into a false sense of security, and then producing one decisive intervention that won the match. The 1904 final was exactly that pattern. He was not the most prominent figure for most of the 90 minutes, but when the moment came, the through ball from Livingstone, the run at Struthers, the driven finish, he was utterly precise. That was the quality that made him the best player of his generation. Final score: Manchester City 1, Bolton Wanderers 0, 61,374. At the Crystal Palace Stadium. Manchester City's triumph contained a dark footnote that belongs in this history. Within a year of their cup win, the club was engulfed in scandal. Billy Meredith was accused of attempting to bribe an Aston Villa player to influence a league match. The FA investigation led to Meredith being suspended, and further inquiry revealed that City had been making illegal payments to players well beyond the permitted maximum wage. The club was effectively dismantled. Their best players were sold at a specially convened public auction, and at that auction Manchester United bought Meredith and 3 other top players for a fraction of their true value. The transfer of Meredith from City to United is one of the most extraordinary episodes in Manchester football history. The path from City's 1904 Cup win to United's 1909 Cup win runs directly through Meredith's feet and the auction room. The period between the 1901 and 1909 Cup finals was one of the most fertile in the history of English football, and not only because of what happened at Crystal Palace. In 1907, the Players' Union was founded, an organisation that would eventually become the Professional Footballers Association, the body that represents professional footballers to this day. In 1907, a dispute between the Union and the Football League over the maximum wage and retain and transfer system came close to a general strike. Players on a maximum of £4 per week were asking for more. The League refused. The dispute eventually subsided without a strike, but the underlying tensions between labour and capital in professional football were clearly articulated for the first time in this period. They have never entirely gone away. The maximum wage, introduced in 1901 at £4 per week, was one of the most significant regulations in English football history. It prevented clubs from simply buying every great player by offering them more money than anyone else could pay. In theory, this created a more competitive environment. In practice, it meant that clubs competed for players through other means, better facilities, more generous signing-on fees, under-the-counter payments that the FA occasionally discovered and punished. The Manchester City scandal of 1904–05 was the most high-profile example, but it was far from the only one. Alf Common, Sheffield United's inside forward who scored in the 1902 replay, was in February 1905 transferred from Sunderland to Middlesbrough for £1,000, the first player in history to be transferred for 4 figures. The FA immediately investigated, concerned that such fees would lead to competitive imbalance. The fee was permitted, but the controversy it generated reflects the football establishment's real anxiety about the commercialization of the game. Football, in the Edwardian era, was already a business. The question was how big a business, and who was going to control it. FA Cup, 1904–1905, Villa and the record attendance. In this year, Albert Einstein published his special theory of relativity. He was 26, working as a patent clerk in Bern, and nobody paid much attention. Aston Villa claimed their 4th FA Cup, beating Newcastle United 2-0 in front of 100 on 1,000. That attendance figure is worth sitting with. For context, the first FA Cup final in 1872 had 2,000 spectators. In 33 years, the crowd had grown by more than 50 times. The FA Cup final was, without question, the biggest sporting event in the world. Newcastle United were by this point a formidable club. They had won the First Division Championship in 1904–05. They were league champions coming into this final, and they had talent throughout the side. Their captain was Andy Aitken, a commanding half-back. Among the most intellectually interesting figures in the side was Colin Vetch, a thoughtful and innovative footballer. He played with tactical sophistication, thinking about shape and movement in ways that most players of the era simply did not. He was also unusually deeply concerned about players' conditions and rights. He would later be one of the founders of the Association Football Players Union, a body the Football League tried vigorously to suppress. That the man who organized the union was also the captain of one of the era's greatest clubs tells you something about the complexity of Edwardian football's labor relations. Their goalkeeper was Jimmy Lawrence, who would eventually play over 500 times for the club. They came to the Crystal Palace Stadium pursuing the double. Villa's run to the final included a first-round win over Leicester Fosse, a second-round win over Bury, a comfortable quarter-final win over Fulham, and a semi-final against Everton that went to a replay. The first match at Stoke ended 1-1, before Villa won the replay 2-1 at the City Ground in Nottingham. They arrived at Crystal Palace as worthy finalists, if not outright favourites. Harry Hampton scored both of Villa's goals. Hampton was a powerful, direct centre-forward, not a subtle or technical player, but tremendously effective in the penalty area. His first goal came after just 2 minutes, a driven finish from close range that rocked Newcastle before they had settled. His second in the 76th minute completed the scoring. Newcastle, despite their league form, could not find a way through Villa's defence. The double that Veach and his teammates had chased so hard that season would not be theirs. This was Villa's fourth FA Cup win. They were, at this point, one of the most successful clubs in the history of the competition. With 4 wins, one behind Wanderers 5 and Blackburn Rovers 5, their golden era, the 1890s and the early 1900s, represents one of the greatest sustained periods of success in English football. Their supporters of this era had been extraordinarily well served. Let's look at Newcastle's position entering this final more carefully, because it tells you something important about the Cup's capacity to humble even the greatest clubs. They had won the First Division in 1904-05, coming in as league champions. Harry Hampton scored twice to beat them 2-0. Colin Veach was a progressive thinker about football. He would later found the Association Football Players Union, and his tactical ideas about the offside trap were ahead of their time. Yet none of that mattered on this afternoon. Villa were faster, sharper, more cohesive, and Hampton was simply irresistible in the penalty area. By the time Newcastle understood what had hit them, it was too late. This final also illustrates something important about the Cup in the Edwardian era. The sheer size of the occasion was beginning to impose itself on the football. 101,000 people at Crystal Palace means the atmosphere was extraordinary, constant noise, dense crowds spilling down the hillside terraces, the match barely visible to thousands of those present. In those conditions, with a greater nerve and the greater experience of playing in big atmospheres has a significant advantage. Newcastle's 5th final appearance in 7 years by 1908, with only 1 win, became a source of puzzlement in the football world. They were clearly a great club, league champions in 1905, 1907, and 1909 regular cup finalists, rich in talented players, and yet the cup consistently eluded them. The conversation around this failure is one of the first examples in football history of the idea of a jinx, a superstition attached to a particular venue or opponent that resists rational explanation. Their record at the Crystal Palace Stadium was played 5, won none. Something about the ground, the occasion, or the psychological weight of expectation seemed to defeat them. Villa had that experience. They had won the Cup in 1887, 1895 and 1897. They knew how to be there. Final score, Aston Villa 2, Newcastle United 0. 101,117 at Crystal Palace. FA Cup, 1905-1906. Everton finally. In the year Everton finally won their first cup, the San Francisco earthquake killed thousands and leveled the city. HMS Dreadnought, the battleship that would trigger a naval arms race with Germany, had been laid down the previous October. The world in 1906 was louder, faster, and more dangerous than it had been even a decade before. Everton had been to 2 finals and won neither, the 1893 Fallowfield debacle against Wolves and the 1897 defeat to Aston Villa. They would lose again in 1907. This was the gap in the middle, their one success in the competition to this point, and it was a tight, thoroughly unglamorous affair won by a single goal from Sandy Young. Newcastle United were back again, their second final in 2 years, and they had yet to win one. The Geordie faithful had been coming to the Crystal Palace Stadium and going home disappointed with increasing frequency. They were a brilliant team who seemed cursed at the final hurdle. Their league form throughout this period was outstanding, champions in 1905, and would be again in 1907 and 1909, but the cup eluded them. The match on the 21st of April was described by some journalists as the worst FA Cup final in living memory. One reporter called it tame. Another suggested that neither side deserved to win. They were not wrong. It was a cautious, tight, defensively minded affair in which both teams seemed more concerned with not losing than with winning. For 76 minutes it was goalless, and the prospect of a replay was very much in the air. Then Sandy Young, a Scottish forward who had been at Everton since 1901 and who would go on to score more goals for the club than almost anyone before him, met a cross from the right and placed the ball past Lawrence in the Newcastle goal. He simply placed it, cool and accurate, into the corner of the net. It was the only moment of real quality in the match, and it was enough. Everton's supporters, some 75,000 of them at Crystal Palace, erupted. The blue half of Merseyside had been waiting a long time for this. It was, as it turned out, also the only cup final Everton would win for 79 years, until 1985. These long waits are part of the cup's particular kind of torture. Sandy Young's goal was scored in the second half, after 77 minutes of deadlock that had frustrated everyone present. The cross from the right was well struck, and Young met it cleanly. It was not a spectacular goal, it was a competent professional finish from a competent professional forward, but it was worth an FA Cup, and that made it the most important thing Young ever did with a football. He scored over 100 league goals for Everton in his career there, but none of them has his name in the cup final record books the way this one does. Final score: Everton 1, Newcastle United 0. Approximately 75,609 at the Crystal Palace Stadium. Everton's route to this final had included some significant results. They beat Liverpool 2-0 in the semi-final at Villa Park, which was a result of enormous local significance on Merseyside. Liverpool were on their way to winning the First Division title that very season, and to beat them was a statement of quality that gave Everton huge confidence going into the Crystal Palace Stadium. The blue half of Liverpool, tired of watching their red neighbours claim trophies, had organised enormous support for the journey south. Newcastle's route, by contrast, had been utterly dominant. They beat Grimsby Town 6-0 in the first round, Derby County in the second round after a replay, Blackpool 5-0 in the third, Birmingham in the quarter-final after another replay, and Woolwich Arsenal 2-0 in the semi-final, all without conceding a goal across the whole competition. They had been in this position 3 times in 4 years and had lost twice. The psychological weight of repeated failure was beginning to be discussed openly in the press. Why couldn't they win the cup? The answer, insofar as there was one, lay partly in the nature of the Crystal Palace Stadium as a neutral venue. Newcastle's supporters could not create a home atmosphere there. They were a long way from home, playing against clubs who had their own contingents of passionate supporters. The great roar of St James's Park, which could intimidate any team, was absent at Crystal Palace. What remained was the quality of the players, which was substantial, and the nerve to perform on the biggest day. That nerve was the thing Newcastle consistently lacked at the Crystal Palace Stadium, and it would be their undoing twice more before they finally won there. The FA Cup, by 1906, had developed a rhythm and a culture that was distinctly its own. The January announcement of the first-round proper draw was a national event. Newspapers carried the details prominently. Clubs scrutinized the matches they had been given. Supporters planned their excursions. The competition had its own language. A difficult draw, a replay away from home, a semi-final at a neutral venue. Its own milestones. 5th round meant you were in the last 16. Quarter-final meant last 8. Semi-final meant the Crystal Palace Stadium was possible. Every club in the country knew where they stood in the narrative at every point. The competition had also developed its superstitions and traditions. The holders entered at the first round and were thought to have a psychological advantage or disadvantage depending on your perspective. The neutral venue for the semi-finals was a source of endless argument. Was Villa Park more convenient for a Northern or Midland club? Was Bramall Lane really neutral? The FA's decisions were second-guessed constantly, and the final itself, at the Crystal Palace Stadium, was surrounded by ceremony and social ritual. The pre-match promenades in the grounds, the band performances, the dignitaries in the stands, the moment when the trophy was presented by whatever lord or politician had been persuaded to do the honours. FA Cup, 1906 to 1907. The Wednesday's revenge. In the year the Wednesday beat the holders at Crystal Palace, the Lusitania had been launched on the Clyde the previous June, the largest ship in the world, and already at sea. Picasso was preparing to paint Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. The Edwardian world was comfortable on the surface, but the intellectual currents beneath it were running fast and strange. Sheffield Wednesday, still known officially in this era as the Wednesday, won their second FA Cup by beating the holders Everton 2-1. It was a much better game than the 1906 final had been, and it produced one of those cup final moments that you can almost see across the decades. Wednesday's route to the final had included victories over Wolves, Sunderland and Liverpool. Everton had beaten West Bromwich Albion and Bolton on their way back to the Crystal Palace Stadium, hoping to defend the trophy they had won so narrowly the previous season. The match opened quickly. Jimmy Stewart of Wednesday scored after 20 minutes to put them ahead. Jack Sharp, the same Sharp who had played in Everton's winning side in 1906, equalised for the Holders just before half-time with what was described as a picture goal, a superb finish. 1-1 at the interval, and the final was perfectly poised. And then, with only 4 minutes remaining, came the moment that settled it. A throw-in for Wednesday on the right flank. The ball played into the penalty area. Wednesday's centre-forward, in an instinctive move that nobody quite anticipated, hooked the ball across the goalmouth. George Simpson, the outside left, arrived late at the far post and headed it into the net. An unexpected, improvised, wonderful goal. Everton had no time to respond. For Wednesday, it was a satisfying completion. The club that had won the 25th Cup in 1896, claiming their second 11 years later. For Newcastle, knocked out in the first round that season by the Crystal Palace Football Club, the very club who played their home games at the stadium where the final was held, it was further evidence that Crystal Palace as a location brought them nothing but trouble. The story of how Simpson scored the winner for Wednesday deserves a moment of attention because it captures something essential about the cup. A throw-in, not a corner, not a free kick, not a piece of elaborate build-up play, a throw-in from the touchline 4 minutes from the end of the match. The ball was hooked across goal by Wednesday's centre-forward. Simpson arrived at the far post with no marker, headed into an empty net. He had been relatively anonymous for much of the match. He became the hero. This is the cup, distilled. The player nobody was watching. The moment nobody anticipated. The goal nobody could have predicted. Wednesday's second cup win completed a satisfying story arc for a club that had been one of the first significant northern sides to challenge the southern establishment back in the late Victorian era, reaching the final in 1890, only to lose 6-1 to Blackburn Rovers. That 1890 final had been a chastening experience. By 1907, they were a settled, well-organised First Division club with good cup pedigree. 2 wins, a record to be proud of. Final score: Sheffield Wednesday 2, Everton 1, 84,584 at the Crystal Palace Stadium. That season also brought a significant adjustment to the offside rule. Before 1907, a player could technically be caught offside anywhere on the pitch. If the defending team pushed high enough, you could be offside in your own penalty area. From 1907, that ended. A player in his own half could never be offside. It was the first real step toward the more open game. The Wednesday's win over Everton gave their supporters their first taste of cup success in 11 years, since the 1896 final against Wolverhampton Wanderers. Sheffield Wednesday, still called the Wednesday officially, the day of the week being the day on which they originally met to play, were not the most glamorous club of the era, but were consistently solid, well-organised and capable of producing the kind of result that the cup demands, a performance that exceeds your normal level on the one day that matters most. George Simpson's late header, his only significant contribution to the match, became the kind of goal that defines careers and cup runs. He was not the most prominent Wednesday player. He was not the one expected to win the match. He simply arrived at the right place at the right moment. And that is the cup's essential truth delivered in one simple header. You do not need to be the best player on the pitch. You need to be in the right place at the right time. Football, reduced to its most fundamental principle. The 1907 final also confirmed something important about the difficulty of retaining the cup. Everton had won it in 1906 and come back in 1907, a natural and admirable ambition. But retaining it is always harder than winning it. A cup winner has a target on their back. Every club they meet in the following year's competition knows they beat you. Everton felt this. They were beaten by Wednesday, who were hungrier and better organised on the day. FA Cup, 1907 to 1908. Wolves from the Second Division. In the year Wolves beat Newcastle at Crystal Palace, the first Model T would roll off Henry Ford's production line in Detroit that October. Kenneth Hunt, who scored Wolves' first goal, would also win an Olympic gold medal with Great Britain that autumn, in London. The same Olympic Games that introduced the marathon distance of 26 miles and 385 yards. This is a remarkable result. Wolverhampton Wanderers were ninth in the second division in 1907-08. They had been relegated 2 seasons previously and were in the middle of a difficult rebuilding period. Newcastle United, their opponents in the final, had won the first division title the previous season. They had been league champions, the best side in the country, and they came to the Crystal Palace Stadium expecting finally to collect the cup they had been denied so repeatedly. In this season's cup, Wolves had beaten several decent sides to get this far. The semi-final brought them against Southampton, who they beat 2-0. Newcastle's route to the final had taken them past Nottingham Forest in the first round, West Ham United 2-0 in the second, Liverpool 3-1 in the third, and Grimsby Town 5-1 in the quarter-final. Their semi-final was against Fulham, and they won it 6-0, a record margin for a cup semi-final that still stands. 6-0. Newcastle were in magnificent form. And then they walked into Wolves. And Wolves, who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, produced one of the great giant killing performances in the competition's history. The match had a peculiar symmetry about it. Every player on the pitch whose surname began with the letter H scored a goal. Kenneth Hunt, Wolves' right half, hit a long shot from distance 40 minutes in that. Lawrence in the Newcastle goal could only help into his own net. George Headley doubled the lead 3 minutes later with a quick shot into the far corner after eluding 2 challenges. James Howie pulled one back for Newcastle after a corner in the 73rd minute, the Magpies' first goal in 3 final appearances. And then winger Billy Harrison, who had woken up that morning to learn his wife had given birth to triplets, sealed it for Wolves in the 85th minute. For Newcastle United, this was yet another defeat in a final at Crystal Palace. 5 appearances at the ground, 0 victories at the venue itself. Their one win had required a replay at Goodison Park. The Crystal Palace jinx, if it existed, was real. The 1907-08 Cup competition was notable for something beyond the final. 13 of the First Division's 20 clubs were beaten by lower division opposition during the rounds, a record number that has never been equalled in a single season. Reading beat Wolves conquerors in one of the later qualifying rounds before being knocked out themselves. Bristol Rovers beat Portsmouth. Swindon Town, a Southern League club, beat Burnley, a First Division side, in the third round. The traditional hierarchy of the football pyramid was being turned on its head at every level of the competition, which created both chaos and excitement in equal measure. Supporters who had come to expect their side to progress until they met someone from the same or higher division discovered that in the Cup of 1908, meeting anyone was potentially lethal, and into this atmosphere of chaos, Second Division Wolves arrived at Crystal Palace as finalists and beat the league champions. It was entirely of a piece with the competition that had produced it. The Cup was generating upsets at an extraordinary rate, which speaks to 2 things: the increasing competitiveness of the lower divisions as professionalism spread, and the inherent unpredictability of a single-match elimination format where any team can beat any other team on the right day. The day trippers who came to see their team beaten were, on this evidence, very likely to get what they had come to see. Kenneth Hunt, who scored Wolves' first goal with a long shot from outside the penalty area, was one of the most interesting characters of the Edwardian Cup era. He was an ordained minister of the Church of England, a clergyman who played professional football, who had won an Olympic gold medal with the Great Britain team in the same year as this Cup win. He was a man of parts, in the Victorian phrase. The gold medal and the Cup winner's medal in the same calendar year is a combination that has never been replicated. Final score: Wolverhampton Wanderers 3, Newcastle United 1. 74,067 was the attendance at Crystal Palace. The FA Cup 1908-1909. Manchester United's first. In the year Manchester United won their first cup, Louis Blériot flew across the English Channel in 36 minutes and 30 seconds, the first aeroplane crossing of any stretch of open sea. He landed in a field at Dover. Old barriers of geography were dissolving. The age of powered flight had arrived. Manchester United. The name requires no introduction even to people who know little about football history. In 1909, they won their first FA Cup. It was the beginning of a relationship between that club and this competition that would become one of football's defining stories over the following century. United had won the First Division Championship the previous season, 1907-08, their first ever league title. They came into the 1908-09 Cup as genuine favourites, and this time they delivered. Their manager was Ernest Mangnall, a meticulous and thorough man who had transformed the club from a struggling outfit into champions. Their key players included the Welsh winger Billy Meredith, yes, the same Meredith who had won the cup with Manchester City in 1904, who had since moved across the city in controversial circumstances, plus the halfback Charlie Roberts, a craggy, intelligent leader, and two Turnbull forwards, Jimmy and Sandy, who between them caused mayhem in opposition defences throughout the campaign. Their route to the final included a quarter-final against Burnley at Turf Moor that was abandoned after 72 minutes with Burnley leading. The rescheduled match produced a hard-fought 3-2 win for United, Burnley having led for much of that afternoon too. Their semi-final against Newcastle, the long-suffering Magpies, ended 1-0, Harold Halse the scorer. Bristol City were the opponents in the final. They had been elected to the Football League only in 1901 and promoted to the First Division in 1906, which made their appearance in a cup final a remarkable achievement for a relatively young club. Their star player was Billy Wedlock, an England international centre-half of genuine quality, and they came to the Crystal Palace Stadium with real belief. On the morning of the final, Sandy Turnbull failed a fitness test on a troublesome knee injury. His manager Mangnall had all but ruled him out, but Turnbull appeared before the match, told Mangnall he could play, and captain Charlie Roberts backed him. He might get a goal, and if he does we can afford to carry him. It was prophetic. 22 minutes in, Harold Halse hit the crossbar. The ball fell at Turnbull's feet and he drove it past goalkeeper Harry Clay. 1-0. And that was that. Turnbull was later reduced to limping around the field, effectively a passenger, as he had always known he would be. But the goal was scored, United had their cup, and Meredith, 7 years after winning it with City, had a second winner's medal. Both teams had changed from their usual red shirts for the occasion. United wore white with a red chevron action flash. Bristol City wore blue. The kit presentation itself produced one of the minor curiosities of the match's build-up. United hired music hall comedian George Robey, one of the most famous entertainers in England, to present the new white shirts to the players at a special ceremony before they left for London. This was showmanship typical of the Edwardian relationship between sport and entertainment. Football was becoming a spectacle, clubs were becoming brands, and the staging was understood to be as much about publicity as practicality. The match at the Crystal Palace Stadium was watched by 71,401 people. Harry Moger in the United goal was at his best when Bristol City needed him to fail, Hardy's first-half shot being the most notable save. The result was tighter than history tends to remember it. The Manchester United of 1909 were an excellent side. Charlie Roberts, their captain, was a half-back of the highest quality, the kind of player who organised everything around him, who read the game 3 moves ahead, who set the defensive shape from the middle of the park. His insistence on wearing shorts that were shorter than regulations stipulated, he considered the standard long shorts impractical, led to a running dispute with the Football League that tells you something about his independent character. Billy Meredith, now 35 years old, was still performing at the highest level. He had joined United after falling out dramatically with Manchester City over a bribery allegation, a complex affair that resulted in City being banned from signing their own players and United swooping to acquire Meredith and several others. The circumstances of his move across the city had been controversial, but his ability on the pitch was not in question. Winning the cup with United 5 years after winning it with City made him the only player in history to have won the FA Cup with both Manchester clubs. He still had the toothpick. Manchester United's first cup final was also notable for an administrative oddity that would have lasting consequences for the history of the trophy itself. After the final, United had their own replica of the cup made by a jeweller as a commemorative object. The Football Association noticed this and were alarmed. They did not own the copyright to the design of the current trophy, which meant anyone could copy it. They immediately commissioned a new design, the one made by Fattorini and Sons of Bradford that came into use in 1911 and that we still recognize today. It is a delicious piece of football history that Manchester United, by making a souvenir, inadvertently caused the most famous trophy in English football to be redesigned. Bristol City's appearance in this final, their first and only major final appearance to date, represents the most remarkable achievement in the club's history. They had been in the Football League for only 8 years, had been in the First Division for only 3, and had a crowd of around 15,000 people watching their home games at Ashton Gate. The cup run took them past Southampton in the first round, Bury in the second, Norwich City in the third, and Glossop in the quarter-final before they beat Derby County 2-1 in the semi-final after a draw. That they lost the final 1-0 to a United side with much greater experience of big occasions was no disgrace at all. They gave a good account of themselves, and Hardy's shot, saved magnificently by Moga, deserved better. Sandy Turnbull did not live to see the extent of United's subsequent cup success. He died on the 3rd of May 1917, killed at the Battle of Arras during the First World War. He was 32 years old. Final score: Manchester United 1, Bristol City 0, 71,401 at the Crystal Palace Stadium. FA Cup 1909 to 1910. Newcastle. At last. In the year Newcastle finally won the cup, Halley's Comet made its closest approach to Earth in May. Thousands of people, genuinely afraid, bought special anti-comet pills sold by enterprising charlatans promising protection from the poisonous gases the comet would trail across the atmosphere. It is easy to laugh at them now. In 1910, the comet was as mysterious and threatening as anything people had encountered. The fear was real, even if the pills were worthless. Every era has its version of this. Ours has people drinking bleach to ward off 5G signals. The details change. The charlatans do not. A hung parliament had been returned in January. The great Edwardian age of certainty was beginning to crack. Newcastle United had been to 4 finals at Crystal Palace. Let us count them, because they deserve to be counted. Lost to Aston Villa in 1905, lost to Everton in 1906, lost to Wolves in 1908, drew with Barnsley in 1910, and won the replay. 4 finals at the ground, 1 win that required leaving the ground to achieve. The Crystal Palace jinx, if you believed in such things, had them firmly in its grip. Their semi-final against Swindon Town was comfortable enough, 2-0, and they went to the Crystal Palace Stadium with their usual high expectation and their usual faint sense of doom. Swindon were a Southern League club, which tells you how diverse the Cup's semi-final field was in this period. A First Division powerhouse like Newcastle United could find themselves in the last 4 alongside clubs from the second tier of non-league football. In 1910 they came back, and this time they were paired with Barnsley, a second division club from South Yorkshire who had been playing extraordinary cup football. Barnsley had beaten Everton in the semi-final, which was itself a remarkable result. They played a direct, physical game that higher division opponents consistently found difficult to handle. Their team included Tommy Boyle at centre-half, a commanding presence who would feature in another cup final 2 years later, and Harry Tufnell, their inside forward, who was a constant danger. The first match at Crystal Palace on the 23rd of April was a tense, absorbing affair. Barnsley took the lead after 37 minutes through Tufnell, who got his toe to a cross that looked initially like it had been missed. Newcastle equalised through Jock Rutherford with a header 8 minutes from time. 1-1 at the end, and a replay was required. Newcastle came into the replay at Goodison Park, Liverpool. The Barnsley supporters turned out regardless. Over 55,000 attended despite heavy rain, and mounted police were needed to keep the crowd off the pitch before kick-off. In the second half, the long wait ended. Albert Shepherd, Newcastle's centre-forward, who had been their most dangerous forward throughout the competition, scored twice. Both goals came in the final 40 minutes. The second was a penalty. Newcastle won 2-0, and the cup finally went to St James's Park. Newcastle's 1910 Cup win was, by any fair measure, long overdue. The Magpies had played some of the finest football of the Edwardian era. Their league championship wins of 1905, 1907, and 1909 represent a sustained period of quality that very few clubs in history have matched, and the Cup's continued refusal to acknowledge that quality had become one of football's running stories. After the 1908 defeat to Wolves, a second division side, the press was beginning to ask whether Newcastle simply lacked the Cup temperament. Albert Shepherd's 2 goals in the replay answered that question with some force. He was not a player who lacked nerve. His penalty, the second goal struck cleanly down the middle, was taken with the calm of someone who had been waiting his whole career for this moment and was not going to waste it. Final score at Crystal Palace: Newcastle United 1, Barnsley 1, before 7,147. Replay at Goodison Park: Newcastle United 2, Barnsley 0, before 60,000. For Barnsley, the consolation was considerable. They were a second division club who had reached the Cup final, pushed the eventual winners to a replay, and given the best team in England a game across 2 matches. Their manager, Arthur Fairclough, had built something at Oakwell that exceeded anything their modest resources might have predicted. They would be back, and when they were in 1912, they would go one better. FA Cup, 1910 to 1911. Bradford City and the new trophy. In the year Bradford City won the Cup, the same Bradford that had made the trophy, the Titanic was under construction in Belfast. Roald Amundsen was preparing his expedition to the South Pole. In China, the 5-year-old Qing Emperor Pui was still on his throne. The revolution that would topple him was 6 months away. 2 things make the 1911 Cup final unforgettable, beyond the result itself. The first is that this was the first final played for the new FA Cup trophy, the one designed by Fattorini and Sons of Bradford, the larger, more elaborate design that we still recognize today. The second is that the club that lifted it was Bradford City, themselves from Bradford. The trophy was made in Bradford. Bradford City won it. If you had written this as fiction, it would have been rejected as too convenient. Bradford City's squad in 1911 contained 8 Scotsmen, which was a common profile for English clubs of this era, and reflects the continued importance of Scottish footballing talent in developing the professional game south of the border. Their defensive organisation throughout the competition was outstanding. 3 goals conceded in the entire campaign, including the goalless draw in the first final at the Crystal Palace Stadium, speaks to a team that was disciplined, well-drilled, and remarkably hard to break down. Jimmy Spears, who scored the winning goal in the replay, headed into the net after goalkeeper Lawrence came for the ball and failed to hold it, a costly error at the worst possible moment. Lawrence, who would eventually play over 500 times for Newcastle, setting a record that still stands, had had a difficult match. His error at the critical moment was the kind that defines cup campaigns. A goalkeeper who is outstanding 99 times and fails once, and that once is in a cup final replay with everything on the line. He was not alone in his suffering. Many goalkeepers have had the same experience. The old trophy, the second FA Cup, the replica made after the original was stolen in 1895, was presented by the FA to Lord Kinnaird on its retirement. Kinnaird, who had played in 9 FA Cup finals and been FA president for 33 years, kept it, and after his death in 1923 it remained with his family, until it was sold at Christie's auction house in 2005 for £420,000. It now lives in the National Football Museum. Bradford's road to the final had taken them past New Brompton, Norwich City and Grimsby Town, then Burnley in the quarter-final 1-0, before they beat Blackburn Rovers 3-0 in the semi-final. Their record in the competition was composed, efficient and remarkably consistent. They conceded just 3 goals in 7 matches. For a club that had existed for only 8 years, this was football of a very high order, and it reflected the quality of their management. Peter O'Rourke had built a team with a clear identity and collective discipline that matched any in the First Division. Newcastle in this final were without Albert Shepherd, injured, and without Peter McWilliam, also injured, which represented a significant weakening of their best team. But even a full Newcastle side might have found Bradford's defensive organisation difficult to crack. The Yorkshireman had simply worked out that if you stay organised, stay disciplined, and take your chances when they come, you can beat anyone on a given day. Jimmy Spears' chance came after 15 minutes. He took it. Bradford had their cup, and with it a place in history that the club's subsequent struggles have never diminished. Bradford City were a young club, formed only in 1903, just 8 years before this final. They had been in the Football League since 1903 and in the First Division since 1908, but they were very much still establishing themselves. Their appearance in the final was considered one of the greater upsets of the Edwardian era. Newcastle United, the holders, came back to the Crystal Palace Stadium for their 5th final in 7 years. They had beaten Bury and Northampton Town on the way, plus a hard-fought semi-final against Chelsea, won 3-0. They had played through without conceding a goal in 3 rounds, their team largely intact. Albert Shepherd was injured and unavailable, which was a blow, but they were still favourites. Bradford's route had included wins over New Brompton, Norwich City, and Grimsby Town, then Burnley in the quarter-final 1-0, before they beat Blackburn Rovers 3-0 in the semi-final. They conceded only 3 goals in the entire competition. The first match at Crystal Palace on the 22nd of April finished goalless. Another final, another draw, another replay. The record books show Newcastle failing to win at Crystal Palace for what felt like the 1000th time. The replay at Old Trafford drew 66,646. Jimmy Spears, Bradford's Scottish captain, headed the winning goal after 15 minutes, a header from a corner that owed something to a mistake by Newcastle goalkeeper Jimmy Lawrence. 1-0, and that was enough. Bradford's defence, heroic throughout, held on for the final 75 minutes. The new trophy went to Bradford, made in Bradford, won by Bradford. Football is sometimes a poet. Final score: Bradford City 1, Newcastle United 0. Replay at Old Trafford. The first match at Crystal Palace ended 0-0 before 69,098. Bradford City's cup win was greeted in their city with a celebration that the local press described as the greatest public occasion in Bradford's history to that point. The team returned home to be met by enormous crowds at the railway station and proceeded through the city on open-topped vehicles, the new trophy, made just down the road at Fattorini's workshop, gleaming in the spring sunshine. For a club only 8 years old, it was an astonishing moment. The connection between the trophy and the city that made it is one of those facts that football occasionally produces to remind us that the sport is woven into the social fabric of England in ways that go far beyond the 90 minutes on the pitch. The craftsmen at Fattorini's had made the trophy, their neighbours in Bradford had won it, and the community that surrounded both, the wool merchants and mill workers and shopkeepers of a prosperous Yorkshire city, had something to celebrate that connected them directly to the biggest stage in English football. These moments of alignment between place and achievement are rare. Bradford in 1911 had one. Newcastle's 5th and final failure at Crystal Palace also deserves a moment of reflection. They had 5 final appearances at the venue, with a total record of 1 win in a replay and 4 defeats. In those 4 defeats they had been beaten by Villa, Everton, Wolves and Bradford, 3 of them from a lower division or the Southern League. The Crystal Palace Stadium ground seemed to carry a specific psychological burden for Newcastle that reasonable analysis could not entirely explain. Their players were good enough to win. Their manager, Frank Watt, was experienced and intelligent. The talent was not the problem. Something else, the occasion, the venue, the weight of expectation, consistently undermined them at the final hurdle. FA Cup, 1911 to 1912. Barnsley, from the 2nd Division. In the year, Barnsley beat West Brom in extra time at Bramall Lane. The Titanic sank in the North Atlantic on the 14th of April, killing over 1,500 people. The final replay was 10 days later. The country was still absorbing the scale of it. Captain Scott had died in Antarctica the previous month, 11 miles from a supply depot. April 1912 was full of enormous things happening quietly, out of sight. Barnsley, back again. The South Yorkshire club that had pushed Newcastle all the way in 1910 had returned to the final 2 years later, and this time they won it. They beat West Bromwich Albion 1-0 after extra time in the replay, and the goal, scored in the dying minutes of that extra time by Harry Tufnell, was one of the great Solo Cup final efforts. Barnsley were a 2nd Division club. They became only the 3rd team from outside the top flight to win the FA Cup since the Football League's founding. Their achievement in 1912 is more impressive in some ways than Tottenham's in 1901 and Wolves' in 1908. Both of those sides had exceptional players and one brilliant day. Barnsley had 12 matches of sustained effort, multiple replays, multiple extra times, and a squad depth that allowed them to keep going when it would have been easier to collapse. Their defensive record, 4 goals conceded in 12 matches, was the foundation on which everything was built. Their quarter-final against Bradford City, the holders, was a 4-game marathon lasting 7 hours of football. Let's follow that tie properly because it deserves it. The first match at Bradford ended 0-0. The second match at Barnsley also ended 0-0 after extra time. The third match, at a neutral venue, ended 0-0 after extra time. 3 matches, 270 minutes of football, no goals. And then the fourth match, also at a neutral venue, was finally settled by Barnsley winning 3-2. 7 hours of football to settle one quarter-final tie. The psychological resilience required to play 4 matches against the holders, keep a clean sheet through the first 3, and then win the fourth, it is almost incomprehensible. But it also explains everything about why Barnsley went on to win the cup. A team that can endure that, without breaking, is a team that can endure anything. The semi-final against Swindon Town, won 1-0, was another tight, grinding victory for a team that simply refused to lose. West Brom's route included beating Sunderland, who were then one of the finest clubs in England, 2-1 in the quarter-final. They had also beaten Tottenham Hotspur in the third round. The first match at Crystal Palace on the 20th of April finished goalless before 53,434 spectators. There was, incidentally, an incident during the replay that led directly to a rule change still in force today. Barnsley's right half Glendenning was off the pitch receiving treatment when West Brom attacked and had the goal at their mercy. Glendenning ran back on with one boot on and cleared the ball, denying the attack. After that match, a rule was introduced that any player who has left the field must get the referee's permission before returning. The small administrative moments that cup history produces. The replay at Bramall Lane in Sheffield on the 24th of April went to extra time with the score still 0-0. And then, with 2 minutes remaining of that extra time, Tufnell collected a pass on the halfway line, outpaced both full-backs, rounded the advancing goalkeeper Hubert Pearson, and drove the ball into the far corner. The final whistle followed shortly after. Barnsley had their cup. Tufnell's goal in the dying moments of extra time is one of the great solo cup efforts. He was on the halfway line when Utley played the pass to him, not in a position that immediately suggested danger. The Albion full-backs, Pennington and Cook, were experienced players who knew their business. But Tufnell ran at them with the energy of a man who understood that this was the moment, and he was through them, and he was past the goalkeeper, and the ball was in the net, and the match was over. Contemporary descriptions note that when the final whistle came 2 minutes later, the Barnsley players embraced Tufnell with an intensity that tells you everything about what that goal meant to them. The match ball from the 1912 replay was presented by the victorious Barnsley team to Tiverton Preedy, the clergyman who had founded the club in 1887. Preedy kept it in his study for the rest of his life. When he died in 1928, it was returned to Barnsley Football Club. The image of a clergyman with a football in his study, a reminder of what his act of community organisation had eventually produced, it captures something of the English football story rather well. West Bromwich Albion were, by any fair assessment, the better side across the 2 matches. Their forward play in the replay was admired by those present, and they created more chances. But the cup does not reward better football, it rewards the team that scores more goals. And on this occasion that team was Barnsley. Through one moment of individual brilliance at the most pressurized point of the game. The cup competition of 1911-12 had included some extraordinary earlier round results. Swindon Town from the Southern League had knocked out Everton in the first round. Bradford City, the holders, had been eliminated after their 4-match marathon with Barnsley. Chelsea beat Manchester United 2-0 at Stamford Bridge. Newcastle were beaten by Blackburn Rovers in the second round. By the time the semi-finals arrived, the field had been thoroughly scrambled, which was entirely in keeping with the Cup's tradition of disorder and surprise. Final score: Barnsley 1, West Bromwich Albion 0. The first match at Crystal Palace ended 0-0 before 53,434. FA Cup 1912 to 1913. Villa's fifth and a missed penalty. In the year Villa beat Sunderland at the last great Crystal Palace final, the Suffragettes were intensifying their campaign. Emily Davison threw herself in front of the King's Horse at Epsom 6 weeks later, on the 4th of June, and died of her injuries. The first crossword puzzle appeared. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring caused a riot at its Paris premiere. The old certainties were dissolving everywhere except apparently at Crystal Palace. Hundreds of clubs entered the FA Cup in 1912 to 13. That number tells you more about the competition's growth than almost anything else. When it began in 1871, 15 clubs entered. Now there were nearly 500. The qualifying rounds had been expanded. The FA Cup had become something much larger than its founders had imagined, a vast, sprawling, democratic competition that touched every corner of English football. The final at Crystal Palace on the 19th of April 1913 attracted nearly 122,000, the largest crowd ever assembled for a cup final, and a figure that would not be exceeded until Wembley opened in 1923. Of those 122,000, roughly 20,000 had no view of the game whatsoever, standing on the wrong part of the hillside terracing. They knew from the noise that things were happening, but they couldn't see what. Crystal Palace Stadium's limitations as a venue had been obvious for years. The football authorities had been discussing alternatives, Stamford Bridge, the White City, purpose-built venues, but none had been agreed, and the war that was coming would impose its own solution by making Crystal Palace unavailable. In retrospect, the 1913 final was the last hurrah of a venue that had given the Cup 2 decades of memorable occasions, and the attendance record it set was a final gift to the competition's history. Crystal Palace Stadium's limitations as a venue had been obvious for years. This was, though nobody quite knew it yet, its second-to-last final. Aston Villa met Sunderland, the reigning league champions. Sunderland under Bob Kyle had been extraordinary that season. They had scored 86 goals in 38 league matches, finishing with 54 points, the most ever accumulated in the First Division. They had Charlie Buchan, one of the finest forwards in England. Villa's fifth cup was not a foregone conclusion. The match is remembered, among other things, for a missed penalty. Charlie Wallace of Villa, the man who made the only goal, hit a penalty wide in the first half. It remains one of the few occasions in FA Cup final history when a penalty has been missed. It would not happen again in a final for 75 years, until the 1988 final between Wimbledon and Liverpool. Despite the missed penalty, Villa won. Tommy Barber, their right half, met a corner from Charlie Wallace in the 78th minute and headed the ball past Sunderland goalkeeper Joe Butler. Villa had been goalless until that point, despite the missed penalty and the earlier disallowed goal. They now had 12 minutes to hold on, which they did with some anxiety, but ultimately with the composure of experienced cup finalists. It was Villa's fifth cup, taking them level with Wanderers and Blackburn Rovers at the top of the all-time list. Sunderland's disappointment in this final was acute. They had been magnificent that season, 86 league goals in 38 games, the First Division title won convincingly, and they had come to the Crystal Palace Stadium believing that their day had come at last. They had never won the cup. Their league record was exceptional, with multiple championships, but the cup had always escaped them. The 1913 final was a bad-tempered affair beneath its historic surface. Harry Hampton of Villa and Charlie Thompson of Sunderland had a running feud that flared repeatedly, culminating in both being suspended for a month at the start of the following season. Goalkeeper Sam Hardy left the field injured approximately 15 minutes into the second half, forcing the outfield player Harrop to take over in goal. Villa held on with 10 fit men for a period. And, as an extraordinary footnote, the Women's Social and Political Union allegedly plotted to blow up the stands before the match. The plot came to nothing, but it speaks to the event's importance in national life that anyone considered it worth disrupting. Charlie Wallace's missed penalty in the first half remains one of the strangest moments in cup final history. He had been one of Villa's best players throughout the competition and was having a fine match. The penalty was reasonable, not a difficult kick, not struck under tremendous pressure, but it went wide. Then, minutes later, Wallace provided the cross that led to Tommy Barber's winning header. The man who missed the penalty provided the assist for the goal. Football, at its most oblique and satisfying, simultaneously rewarding and punishing the same person. The 1912-13 FA Cup was entered by hundreds of clubs, which required qualifying rounds before the competition proper began. By the time those qualifying rounds were done, the survivors from non-league football met the First Division giants in the first round proper in January 1913. The gap in quality between a club playing the qualifying and one that had rested all autumn was considerable, but not always insurmountable, and the first round always produced results that surprised. Sunderland's route to this final had been formidable. They beat Clapton Orient 6-0 in the first round, Manchester City 2-0 in the second, and Swindon Town 4-2 in the third. Then came Newcastle, their northeast rivals, in the quarter-final, a tie which required 2 replays and generated enormous local interest. 3 hours of football before Sunderland won the second replay 3-0 at Middlesbrough's Earlsham Park. Then they beat Burnley in the semi-final, drawing the first match before winning the replay 3-2, setting up the Crystal Palace finale. Aston Villa had beaten Derby County, West Ham United, Crystal Palace, Bradford Park Avenue, and Oldham Athletic on the way, a relatively modest sequence by First Division standards, but they had won every match without difficulty. The contrast between the two finalists' routes suggested that Sunderland, who had battled through replays and tight margins, might be more battle-hardened. In the event, Villa's Greater Cup final experience told. Tommy Barber's header was their only moment of quality. Villa were not brilliant on the day, but they were composed, organised and resilient in the way that cup winners generally need to be. This was also, for the record, the first FA Cup final in history that was attended by a crowd larger than 120,000. The official figure of 121,919 stands as the record for the Crystal Palace Stadium, and it has never been beaten at any other neutral venue for an FA Cup final apart from the early Wembley finals of the 1920s. Nobody knew it was the last at the time, but there is a valedictory quality to the occasion in retrospect. The largest crowd ever assembled for a cup final, watching a classic final between two great clubs, in a ground whose days were almost numbered. Final score: Aston Villa 1, Sunderland 0. 121,919 at the Crystal Palace Stadium. The FA Cup 1913-1914. Burnley, the King, and the last Crystal Palace final. The year of the last Crystal Palace final was also the year of the assassin's bullet at Sarajevo. The final was played on the 25th of April 1914. The shots that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand were fired on the 28th of June. At the time of the final, nobody knew what was coming. 3 months later, the armies of Europe were mobilizing. The 43rd FA Cup final was, in ways that nobody present could have anticipated, the last time things would feel entirely normal for many years. Europe was 3 months away from the most catastrophic war in human history. The FA Cup would survive the war. The 1914-15 competition would be completed, but football itself would be transformed by it, suspended for 4 years and emerging into a different world. This was the last summer of the old certainties. Burnley won the cup for the first time in their history, beating Liverpool 1-0 at the Crystal Palace Stadium in what was the ground's last FA Cup final. 476 clubs had entered the competition that season, a record at the time. The match was attended by King George V, the first time a reigning monarch had ever attended a cup final. Tommy Boyle, Burnley's captain, became the first man ever to receive the FA Cup from royal hands. 170 special trains brought supporters south from Lancashire. Burnley had earned their place in the final through a remarkable campaign. Let's follow it round by round, because each stage tells you something about why this particular group of players were ready for the Crystal Palace Stadium and a royal presentation. The first round brought South Shields, leaders of the North Eastern League. Tommy Boyle missed a penalty, which might have set a nervous tone for the campaign. Instead, the team ignored it, with Dick Lindley scoring twice, and Bert Freeman adding a third in a 3-1 win. composed recovery from early adversity, exactly what cup winners need to demonstrate. The second round brought Derby County, a First Division club. The match at Turf Moor in the wind was a scrappy affair, settled by Teddy Hodgson's hat-trick, the most dramatic possible way to win a cup tie, 3 goals from one man who was playing with the kind of confidence that makes it feel inevitable. 3-2 to Burnley. The third round brought Bolton Wanderers, then lying third in the First Division. Burnley beat them 3-0, and the Manchester Guardian declared that on Saturday's form, Burnley should be good enough to win the cup. This was in the third round. The prophets were right. Sunderland in the fourth round, league champions the previous year, still one of the finest clubs in England. The match at Roker Park finished 0-0. Burnley won the replay at Turf Moor. At this point, Burnley had beaten 4 First Division clubs, a feat without precedent in the competition's history at that point, in a single campaign. The semi-final against Sheffield United went to a replay. The first match at Old Trafford ended 0-0, with United claiming a shot had crossed the Burnley goal line. It hadn't, as the referee confirmed. The replay at Goodison Park was settled by Tommy Boyle in the 75th minute, the only goal. A captain scoring the decisive semi-final goal. Burnley became the first club in history to eliminate 5 First Division opponents in a single cup campaign. That record stood for many years. The only comparable achievement in the competition's history came in later decades when clubs with deeper squads and longer cup runs occasionally beat 4 or 5 First Division or Premier League sides, but the completeness of Burnley's 1914 achievement, beating 5, remains in the record books as something extraordinary for a club of modest means from Lancashire who had never won anything of significance before and have not won the FA Cup since. Tommy Boyle, the Burnley captain who lifted the cup from the King's hands, deserves a specific moment of recognition. He was the organising force of everything Burnley achieved in 1914, the defensive solidity, the tactical discipline. He played through injury in the final itself, spending several minutes on the touchline after a collision and returning to the pitch with his head spinning. He held on. He lifted the cup. He was what captains are supposed to be. Liverpool's route included Barnsley, Gillingham and West Ham United, before they beat Aston Villa 2-0 in the semi-final. Liverpool came to their first ever cup final as slight favourites with the bookmakers. Though their league form had been moderate, they would finish 16th that season. The final itself was a cagey, cautious affair for its first 56 minutes. Both teams were respectful of each other's strengths. And then on 57 minutes, Billy Nesbitt picked up the ball on Burnley's right and crossed into the penalty area. Teddy Hodgson met the cross and headed it on. Bert Freeman, an ex-Everton forward who had been signed by Burnley from Everton in 1911, arrived at the far post in the 58th minute and drove the ball first time past Liverpool goalkeeper Kenneth Campbell into the far corner of the net. 1-0. Liverpool pressed hard for the final half hour, chasing an equaliser with increasing urgency. Burnley held on, their defence led magnificently by the indefatigable Tommy Boyle, who suffered a collision late in the game that left him in agony, barely able to continue, yet continued anyway. The whistle came. The cup was presented by the King. Burnley were champions. The Crystal Palace Stadium hosted its 20th and final FA Cup final. It had seen Villa's double, Tottenham's miracle, Newcastle's heartbreaks, Bury's 6 goals, Sandy Brown scoring in every round, the biggest ever crowd. It had served the competition well for 19 years. Now it was time for something new. That something new would be delayed by a world war. But it was coming. Final score. Burnley 1, Liverpool 0. 72,778 at the Crystal Palace Stadium. FA Cup, 1914 to 1915. The Khaki Final. By April 1915, the British Expeditionary Force had suffered 160,000 casualties. Poison gas had been used for the first time at the Second Battle of Ypres, 2 days before this final. Gallipoli would begin the following day. The Lusitania would be sunk 13 days after the Cup final, killing nearly 1,200 people. The crowd at Old Trafford wore khaki. The 44th FA Cup was played in the shadow of a war that had already been going for 9 months, and had already killed hundreds of thousands. The Football Association had debated whether to continue the competition at all. Many in the country felt that football was a frivolity that shamed the nation while young men were dying in France and Belgium. A writer in the Sheffield Daily Telegraph said that Sheffield United were bringing shame on themselves and the city by competing. Others argued that football provided essential relief for workers in the munitions factories, for the families waiting at home, for the soldiers on leave who needed something, anything, that felt like normal life. The FA decided to press on. They were right to feel uncomfortable about it. By April 1915, the British Expeditionary Force had already suffered casualties that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The Western Front was established. The trench systems were being dug. Men who had been watching football the previous season were now in uniform, many of them at the front. The football continued, but it continued with a guilty conscience that coloured everything around it. Sheffield United's route to the final had been steady and well organised. They beat Blackpool in the first round, then Liverpool in the second. Bradford Park Avenue fell in the third round, then Oldham Athletic in the quarter-final, that one needing a replay before United prevailed. Their semi-final opponents were Bolton, whom they beat 2-1 at Blackburn Rovers ground. Chelsea's route had been more unexpected. Nobody had anticipated Chelsea reaching the final at all. They were near the bottom of the first division for most of the season, and their forward line was considered too small for cup football. But they beat Arsenal in the second round and Newcastle in the quarter-final on the way. Their semi-final was against Everton, that season's league champions, and Chelsea won it 2-0 at Villa Park. The final venue was moved from Crystal Palace to Old Trafford in Manchester. The authorities judged that a final in London would disrupt essential war work in the capital. Crystal Palace itself, the great glass exhibition hall whose grounds had hosted 20 cup finals, was in the process of being requisitioned by the Royal Navy as a training depot. The stadium where Sandy Brown had scored in every round in 1901, where Hampton had scored after 2 minutes in 1905, where 121,000 had gathered for Villa and Sunderland 2 years earlier, was being handed over to the war effort. It would host no more cup finals. Old Trafford on the 24th of April 1915 was attended by 49,557 people. Many of them were in uniform. Soldiers on leave, men still in training, men with bandages from wounds sustained at the front. They were everywhere in the crowd. The sight of so many khaki uniforms gave the final its name, the one that has stuck for over a century, the Khaki Final. A cup final played while a war was happening, with the evidence of that war visible in the stands. The football itself was one-sided. A thick fog descended over Old Trafford in the second half, making it difficult for spectators on one side of the ground to see what was happening on the other. Chelsea, already outplayed, could not find a way through Sheffield United's organised defence. Jimmy Simmons opened the scoring for United with a half-volley just before half-time. The final 2 goals came in the last 10 minutes from Stanley Fazakerley and Joe Kitchen. 3-0. Sheffield United, the team who had won the cup in 1899 and 1902, were cup holders again, and they would hold the trophy until 1920. There was nowhere to present it, no final to play, no competition to contest. The war took all of that. Within weeks of the final whistle at Old Trafford, competitive professional football in England was suspended. It would not return for 4 years. In those 4 years, the men who had been playing professional football, and many of the men who had been watching it, went to war. Roughly 2,000 of the 5,000 professional footballers in England in 1914 eventually joined the military services. Of those, the documented roll of honour runs to approximately 300 who were killed. Some of those who did not come back you will have heard of in this story. Sandy Turnbull, the man who scored the winner for Manchester United in the 1909 final, hobbling to goal on a damaged knee while his captain told Mangnall he might get a goal, and they could carry him after that, enlisted in the Middlesex Regiment's Footballers' Battalion. He was transferred to the East Surrey Regiment, promoted to Lance Sergeant, and killed during the Battle of Arras on the 3rd of May 1917. He was 32 years old. His body was never identified. He is commemorated on the Arras Memorial, near the town where he died. He scored the first ever goal at Old Trafford. He scored the only goal of a cup final. Jimmy Spears, Bradford City's captain, who headed the winning goal in the 1911 replay at Old Trafford, whose one contribution to that final was the header that won the first trophy ever lifted by a club that had existed for only 8 years, joined the Queen's own Cameron Highlanders on the outbreak of war. He won the military medal for bravery in the field and was promoted to sergeant. He was killed at Passchendaele on the 20th of August 1917. He was 31 years old. Bradford City, the club he had led to their only major honour, lost 9 players in total during the war. Donald Bell had played for Bradford Park Avenue. The club, Sheffield United, beat in the quarter-final of the 1915 competition. He was the first professional footballer to enlist, joining up in early 1915 before the Footballers' Battalion was even formed. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Green Howards. On the 5th of July 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, he led an attack on a German machine gun position that had been cutting down his men, running 50 yards across open ground with 2 colleagues, killing the crew and silencing the gun. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. He was killed 5 days later in a similar attack. Before he knew the medal had been awarded, he was 25 years old. Walter Tull had played for Tottenham Hotspur and Northampton Town. He was mixed race, the son of a Barbadian carpenter, and had been one of the first black players in the Football League, preceded only by Arthur Wharton, the goalkeeper who had turned professional with Rotherham Town in 1889 and later played for Sheffield United. The Army's own regulations said that officers had to be of pure European descent. The Army promoted him to second lieutenant anyway, one of the first black officers to lead white British troops into battle. He was mentioned in dispatches. He was recommended for the Military Cross. He was killed on the 25th of March 1918 during the German spring offensive near Arras. He was 29 years old. His body was never recovered. Edwin Latheran had helped Blackburn Rovers win the First Division in 1911-12 and 1913-14. He was killed at Passchendaele in October 1917. He was 29 years old. These are the players whose names belong in a cup script, not just because of what they did on a football pitch, but because of what happened to them after the whistle blew on the 1915 final and the competition was put away for the duration. There were thousands more whose names are less famous. The whole first team of Clapton Orient, later Leyton Orient, enlisted together and went to France as a unit. 3 of them were killed on the Western Front. Heart of Midlothian lost 7 players. Brecon City lost 6. Bradford City lost 9. These were not abstractions. They were the players who had beaten your team in the 3rd round, or missed a penalty in the semi-final, or scored the goal that your town talked about for years. They were 22 years old and 25 years old and 28 years old, and they were gone. The cup itself sat in a cabinet at Sheffield United's Bramall Lane ground for 5 years. It had been lifted by the Sheffield United captain on the 24th of April 1915. It would not be lifted again until 1920, when Aston Villa beat Huddersfield Town 1-0 after extra time in a final played at Stamford Bridge, the Crystal Palace Stadium having been lost to football forever. Between those 2 dates, everything changed. The social certainties of the Edwardian era, the confidence in progress and empire and the rightness of things, were shattered in the mud of Flanders and the Somme and Passchendaele. 600,000 British men dead, millions more wounded, gassed, shell-shocked, marked for life. Football came back in 1919-20. The players came back. Those who had survived, some of them with decorations, some with wounds, many with memories they would never speak about. The crowds came back too larger than ever, as if people needed to be together and to watch something and to feel the old certainties of a goal scored, a match won, a trophy lifted. The cup resumed. The great competition, older than the Football League, older than professional football itself, resumed, and it carried on as it always had, absorbing everything that history threw at it and continuing. But something had changed. The Edwardian era, with its enormous Crystal Palace crowds and its uncomplicated confidence, and its gentlemen in top hats presenting trophies to men in thick woolen jerseys, that era was gone. The next block of cups belongs to a different world. Wembley, the White Horse Final, Huddersfield's 3 in a row, Arsenal's dominance, the Bolton years, a competition that had already been running for nearly 50 years, finding its permanent home and the crowds becoming truly extraordinary. We will get to all of that. For now, though, 44 cups. From the first final in 1872, watched by 2,000 people, won by Wanderers, to the Khaki Final of 1915, watched by 49,000 soldiers and workers and civilians huddled against the drizzle at Old Trafford, 44 seasons, the game born, the game growing, the game belonging to everyone who ever cared about it, which, by 1915, was most of the country. The cup survived. The game survived. Some of the players did not. From Aston Villa's double in 1897 to Sheffield United lifting the trophy in an Old Trafford fog while the Western Front swallowed the world. What those 19 competitions show us, above all else, is the cup living up to its mythology. The upsets are more frequent now than they were in the Victorian era. The competition has spread to include hundreds of clubs, and any one of them on any given Saturday can beat anyone. Tottenham, non-league and unheralded, beating Sheffield United to a trophy the Football League's establishment could barely believe they had won. Wolves, 9th in the second division, destroying the first division champions Newcastle 3-1. Barnsley, twice, from the second division, grinding their way to glory through replays and extra time and sheer collective determination. These are the stories that the FA Cup was invented to produce, and it produced them. And at the other end of the scale, Aston Villa bury without conceding a single goal twice, Sheffield United taking the cup back from non-league hands, Manchester United beginning what would become their long and complex relationship with the competition. These too are FA Cup stories. The next block of cups from 1919, after the war, through to the first Wembley final of 1923, belongs to another episode. The competition went to Stamford Bridge for a few years. Then it went to Wembley, where it found its permanent home and the crowds became truly extraordinary. But before we get there is the small matter of the 1914-15 Cup, the Khaki Final, played at Old Trafford as the Crystal Palace Stadium became a war depot, with Sheffield United beating Chelsea 1-0 before a crowd not much above 49,000, the country's young men already dying in France and Belgium. And then 5 years of silence. Football would survive. The cup would survive. But nothing was ever quite the same again. These are the stories that the FA Cup was created to produce. Not just stories of the best teams winning the best matches. Those happen every season in every competition. Stories of the unexpected, the mismatch that becomes a masterpiece, the nobody who scores the only goal, the club that has no business being there and is there anyway, lifting the trophy, taking it home on the train, parading it through streets that have never seen anything like it and will never forget it. In these competitions, those stories came thick and fast. And they came for a structural reason that the Cup's founders understood, even if they couldn't have predicted the specific drama it would generate. The single-match elimination format is the most democratic sporting format ever devised. It gives every participant exactly one chance. It provides no safety net, no second chance, no comfort of an aggregated score over 2 legs. One afternoon, on one pitch, with one referee, against one opponent. Win or go home. The league format rewards consistency over time. The best team across 30 or 38 games usually wins the league. But the best team across 90 minutes of a single match often does not win the cup, because 90 minutes is too short a sample for quality to completely dominate. Luck matters, nerve matters. The goalkeeper who makes one save that nobody expected him to make. The winger who reaches across a tenth of a second before the defender. The referee who makes a decision that the record books do not record, but that determines everything. These factors are amplified in a single-match knockout to a degree that no other format can match. That is what makes the Cup, across its 150 years, the competition it is. And in the competitions we have followed today, from Villa's double in 1897 to Burnley's royal presentation in 1914, those factors were at work constantly, producing results that astonished contemporaries and continue to astonish those of us who study them now. There is one more thing worth saying before we close this chapter. The era from 1897 to 1914 produced the FA Cup's first legends beyond the competition itself, players whose names are still known, whose feats are still remembered, whose stories still repay the telling. Sandy Brown of Tottenham, scoring in every single round of the 1901 Cup. Billy Meredith of Manchester City and then United, the Welsh wizard with his toothpick and his 30 years of elite football. Steve Bloomer of Derby, reaching 3 finals and not winning one, his terrible luck made visible in the empty hands at the end of each afternoon. Sandy Turnbull of United, hobbling to goal on a knee he had no business playing on, dying at Arras 5 years later. Colin Vitch of Newcastle, organising everything for a club that refused to cooperate with history. Harry Tufnell of Barnsley, whose solitary moment of genius in the dying seconds of extra time at Bramall Lane gave a modest South Yorkshire club the greatest afternoon in their history. These are the people behind the statistics. These are the ones who made the results happen. We have the scores and the attendances and the venues. But behind every one of those numbers is a human story, a player who got up that morning not knowing whether they would play the match of their lives or the worst match of their career, who ran onto the pitch and gave everything they had, and whose contribution the world then judged in 90 minutes and reduced to a final score. The Khaki Final of 1914-15, Sheffield United beating Chelsea 3-0 at Old Trafford, the crowd subdued, Crystal Palace requisitioned as a naval depot, closed this era with quiet dignity. And then 5 years of silence. When the Cup returned in 1919-20, the world had changed utterly. The Cup had survived. Some things the war could not entirely destroy. Between the final whistle at Old Trafford in April 1915 and the resumption of the Football League in August 1919, the men who had played in these 19 Cup finals and the thousands who had played the game at every level across the country went to war. Some did not come back. What follows is a roll of honour for those who played in this era and gave their lives. The full documented list of professional footballers killed in the First World War runs to nearly 300 names. These are 8 of the most significant, drawn from the clubs and competitions covered in this story. Sandy Turnbull, born Hurlford, Ayrshire, Scotland, July 30th, 1884. Died Arras, France, May 3rd, 1917. Aged 32. Forward. Manchester City, Manchester United. FA Cup winner with both Manchester clubs, 1904 with City, 1909 with United, for whom he scored the only goal of the final against Bristol City, having hobbled to the pitch on a damaged knee. He scored Manchester United's first ever goal at Old Trafford. He had been banned from football for life in 1915 for his role in a match-fixing scandal, but the ban meant nothing once the war came. He enlisted in the Middlesex Regiment's Footballers Battalion, was transferred to the 8th Battalion East Surrey Regiment and promoted to Lance Sergeant. He went into action near the village of Chertsey as part of the Third Battle of the Scarpe. He was wounded multiple times but continued advancing. His body was never found. He is commemorated on the Arras Memorial to the missing. He had 4 children. Jimmy Spears, born Govan, Glasgow, Scotland. March 22nd, 1886. Died Passchendaele, Belgium, August 20th, 1917. Aged 31. Inside forward. Rangers, Clyde, Bradford City, Leeds City. Captain of Bradford City when they won the FA Cup in 1911, the first final played for the trophy made in his own city, which he lifted before leading the team on parade through Bradford's streets. He had been exempt from conscription as a married man with 2 young children. He volunteered anyway. He served with the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, rose to sergeant, and was awarded the Military Medal for bravery during the Second Battle of Arras in May 1917. He was killed 3 months later, during an attack east of St. Julian, shot in the thigh and left in a shell hole. His remains were recovered from the battlefield in 1919, and he is buried at Dokey Farm, New British Cemetery, near Ypres. His FA Cup winner's medal sold at auction in 2000, and 3 for £26,210. A record for a cup medal, and was bought by a Bradford City supporter. Donald Bell, born Harrogate, Yorkshire, England, December 3rd, 1890. Died the Somme, France, July 10th, 1916, aged 25. Right back. Crystal Palace, amateur. Newcastle United, amateur, Bradford Park Avenue. The only English professional footballer to receive the Victoria Cross. He was the first professional footballer to enlist, joining up in November 1914 and receiving a commission as second lieutenant in the Green Howards. On the 5th of July 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, he led an attack on a German machine gun position near Horseshoe Trench that had been cutting down his men. Running 50 yards across open ground under fire, he and 2 colleagues silenced the gun, killing or capturing its crew. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for this action. 5 days later, attempting a similar attack on another position, he was killed. He is buried at Gordon Dump Cemetery, Ovillers-la-Boisselle. He was 25 years old. Walter Tull. Born Folkestone, Kent, England, April 28th, 1888. Died the Somme, France, March 25th, 1918. Aged 29. Inside forward. Clapton, Tottenham Hotspur, Northampton Town. One of the first black players in the Football League, the son of a Barbadian carpenter and an English mother. He played for Tottenham between 1909 and 1911, before moving to Northampton. He enlisted in the Footballers' Battalion in December 1914, served on the Somme and at Passchendaele, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant, one of the first black officers to lead white British troops into battle. He was recommended for the Military Cross for his leadership during the Italian campaign of 1917. He was killed during the German Spring Offensive near Faverolles, leading his men across no man's land. His body was never recovered. He is commemorated on the Arras Memorial to the Missing. He was 29 years old. Edwin Latheron. Born Carlin, Howe, Yorkshire, England, December 22nd, 1887. Died Passchendaele, Belgium, October 14th, 1917. Aged 29. Inside forward. Blackburn Rovers. One of the finest players of the Edwardian era, inventive, brilliant in the air despite his small stature, and known as one of the most unselfish forwards in England. He helped Blackburn Rovers win the First Division Championship in 1911-12 and 1913-14, scoring 94 league goals in 257 appearances. He was capped twice for England. He enlisted in the Royal Field Artillery in 1916 and was posted to France. He was killed when a shell burst near his dugout at Passchendaele. On the 14th of October 1917, a letter from his Rovers teammate, published in the Liverpool Echo, read, "Latheron was happy and strong and was a tremendous worker, and if anybody has done his bit in this war, it is he." He is buried at Vlamertinghe Military Cemetery near Ypres. He was 29 years old. Lee Roos. Born Holt, near Wrexham, Wales, November 27th, 1877. Died the Somme, France, October 7th, 1916. Aged 38. Goalkeeper. Aberystwyth Town, Stoke City, Everton, Sunderland, Celtic, Aston Villa, Arsenal. 24 caps for Wales. Arguably the most famous goalkeeper in England at his peak, the first celebrity footballer, known to the public as much for his personality as his play. The Welsh amateur who hired private trains when he missed his connection, dated music hall stars, and held beat the goalkeeper competitions for spectators. He was 36 when the war began, well above conscription age. He served anyway, first with the Royal Army Medical Corps in France and Gallipoli, then returned to London and enlisted as a private with the Royal Fusiliers. He was awarded the Military Medal for bravery during his first action in August 1916, fighting through a flamethrower attack with his clothes on fire, refusing to leave the line, throwing grenades until his arm gave out. He was killed 6 weeks later during the Battle of the Somme, running toward German lines near the village of Gudecourt. His body was never found. He is commemorated, misspelled as Rouse rather than Roos, on the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing. The error was corrected by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in 2016, a century after his death. He was 38 years old. Bernard, born Rushton, Northamptonshire, England. July 9th, 1887. Died Ramicourt, France, October 3rd, 1918. Aged 31. Forward. Northampton Town, Burton United, Derby County. 3 Football League appearances for Derby in 1906–07. An ordained Church of England minister, chaplain at Wellingborough School when the war began. He volunteered, was commissioned into the Sherwood Foresters, and served continuously on the Western Front for 4 years. He was wounded at least 11 times. He was awarded the Military Cross, a bar to the Military Cross, and the French Croix de Guerre with palm. His brother Arthur was killed at the Battle of Loos in 1915. On the 29th of September 1918, just 5 weeks before the armistice, he led his battalion across the St. Quentin Canal under heavy fire, personally rushed a German field gun, and knocked out 3 of its crew, and turned the tide of an attack that had been pinned down. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. 4 days later, leading another attack near Ramicourt, he was killed by a sniper. He is the only Church of England clergyman to receive the Victoria Cross as a combatant in any war. He is buried at Bellicourt British Cemetery. He was 31 years old. His son was born 8 months after his death. Evelyn Lintott, born Godalming, Surrey, England, November 2nd, 1883. Died the Somme, France, July 1st, 1916. Aged 32. Halfback. Woking, Plymouth Argyle, Queen's Park Rangers, Bradford City, Leeds City. 7 caps for England. PFA chairman. The first professional footballer to hold a military commission. A schoolmaster by profession, he taught throughout his playing career. He joined the Leeds Pals, the 15th Battalion West Yorkshire Regiment, in September 1914, one of the first professional players to volunteer. He was promoted to lieutenant before the battalion left for Egypt, and then France. He was killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July 1916, the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, when nearly 20,000 men died and 57,000 were casualties. Lieutenant Lintott led his platoon forward at 7:30 in the morning toward the heavily fortified village of Serra. A report on his death recorded, Lintott killed by machine gun at 3 p.m. in the advance. He was struck in the chest. A letter described his end. His death was particularly gallant. He has no known grave and is commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing. He was 32 years old. Approximately 300 professional footballers from the British leagues were killed in action during World War I. Out of roughly 2,000 professional players who served in the British Armed Forces, many played for teams that suffered significant losses, such as Hearts, which lost 7 players, and Bradford City, which lost 9. These men played the game in this era. They played it in front of crowds that grew from 48,000 to 121,000. They played for towns and cities and clubs that their supporters identified with completely and permanently. They went to war because they were asked to, or because they felt they had to, or because they believed it was right. They died at Arras, at Passchendaele, on the Somme near Ramicourt. Several of them have no known grave. The documented roll of professional footballers killed in the First World War runs to nearly 300 names. This script names 8 of them. There were nearly 300 others. The competition they played in continues to this day. The clubs they played for still exist. Some of the grounds still stand. The game remembers them imperfectly and intermittently. The memories are long gone now, but the legacy remains.